Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. It's strange how memories can lie dormant for years, only to surface with crystal clarity when something triggers them. I'm writing this account now in 2024, but the events I'm about to describe took place in 2015, when I was 17. Sometimes I wonder if I should share this story at all. If by putting these words to paper, I might somehow summon back the thing that haunted us. But the weight of keeping this secret has become too heavy to bear alone. Our family's move to Michigan hadn't been planned. My father's company had undergone a sudden restructuring, and we found ourselves transplanted from suburban Connecticut to the rural Midwest with barely 2 months' notice. The house we ended up buying was at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backing up against dense woods that stretched for miles. Across the street, a vast cow pasture rolled toward the horizon, creating an illusion of isolation despite the neighboring houses on either side. I remember the day we first viewed the property. It was early March, and patches of dirty snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees. The real estate agent, a nervous woman who kept checking her phone, seemed eager to close the deal quickly. Now I wonder if she knew something. If there was a reason the previous owners had left so abruptly, leaving behind pieces of furniture and personal items as if they'd fled in a hurry. The house itself was nothing remarkable at first glance, a 2-story colonial built in the late 1990s, painted a subdued sage green with white trim. But there was something about it that caught your eye and held it, like a sentence that seems normal until you read it twice. The windows were slightly too large for the facade, creating an unsettling effect that you couldn't quite put your finger on. The front door was solid oak, carved with an intricate pattern that our father said was typical Victorian decoration, but which I later realized formed abstract shapes that seemed to shift when viewed too long. From the day we moved in, something felt wrong. Not in any way I could articulate at first, just a persistent unease that seemed to hover at the edges of my consciousness. The air inside the house was always too still, as if it were holding its breath. Sounds behaved strangely. Conversations in one room would carry perfectly to another, while shouts from right next door would be muffled beyond recognition. My younger sister, Madeline, who was 14 at the time, felt it too. She would sometimes stop mid-sentence while we were unpacking, cocking her head as if listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. Our parents dismissed our concerns, attributing them to the natural adjustment period of moving to a new home. Mother threw herself into redecorating as if enough fresh paint and new curtains could mask the fundamental wrongness of the place. Father spent long hours in his new home office, the door firmly closed, on endless conference calls that seemed to echo oddly through the heating vents. I chose a bedroom on the second floor, overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. The previous owners had painted it a pale blue that reminded me of winter skies, and something about the color seemed to repel the shadows that gathered so thickly in other parts of the house. I remember standing at my window that first evening, watching the sun set through the tree line. The shadows seemed to move differently here, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the normal physics of light. The trees themselves appeared to shift position when viewed from different windows, though I told myself this was just a trick of perspective. That first night, none of us slept well. The house made unfamiliar sounds, not the normal creaks and groans of a structure settling, but something more deliberate. It sounded everyone.
Almost like
I'm
conversation,
Mr. Edison,
conducted
and I'm here
in
to
whispers,
guide you into
just
a peaceful
below
slumber.
the threshold of
If you find this video
When I
helpful,
mentioned this at
please give
breakfast
it
the
a
next
thumbs
morning,
up. Mother
and
laughed
subscribed
nervously
to the channel
and said all
I'd love to know
houses had
where
their
you're from.
crooks.
But I
what time
noticed
it is
she'd
as
already
you
begun
unwind.
pricing
So
sound
settle in,
dampening
get cozy,
insulation,
and
let
Father
the
had installed
relaxation
new
begin.
locks on all the interior doors. The initial months in the house followed a pattern that would become memories can lie dormant periods for years, of relative normalcy, only to surface with crystal clarity when something triggers them. Looking back, this account now, I realize now that the entity, but the events I'm about to describe, took place in 2015, was testing when I was 17, learning our routines. Sometimes I wonder if I should share this story at all. It started by putting these words almost to paper. I might like somehow a predator summon back with the thing that haunted us. The first truly inexplicable event occurred 3 weeks after we moved heavy. I had developed a habit of arranging my textbooks on my desk in precise order. My father's company had undergone a sudden restructuring that helped me maintain some sense of control in our new suburban Connecticut. One morning in late rural Midwest, I woke to find them barely 2 months stacked in the corner. The house we ended up buying was at the end of a quiet facing the wall. When I mentioned this to my mother, that stretched she suggested I must have moved across the street, studying a vast cow pasture. But I knew I had rolled toward the horizon. Was the fact creating that the dust on my desk showed no trails despite the neighboring houses indicating how the books had been moved. Similar incidents began occurring throughout the house with increasing frequency. It was early March. Mother's carefully arranged dirty snow still clung to the shadows beneath the trees. The real estate agent documents would vanish from his locked office her phone, only to reappear days later in the basement quickly. Now I wonder smelling faintly of damp earth. If there was a Madeline's the previous owners which she'd stopped playing with years ago, leaving behind pieces of furniture, would be found in different poses as if they'd fled in a hurry. Their heads invariably turned to face was nothing remarkable at first glance. The local wildlife behavior became increasingly erratic. The neighbors' dogs, 3 well-trained German shepherds, but there was would often gather at the edge of their yards, staring intently into the woods sentence that seems normal. Their behavior was unsettling, not just the windows were slightly too large for the facade, but for their complete creating an unsettling effect, normally vocal at the slightest provocation. The front door was rigid and silent for carved with an intricate pattern raised that our father said was something we couldn't see with their decoration. The cows, which I later realized formed abstract even strange behavior when viewed. They would sometimes bunch together in tight groups. From the day we moved facing outward in defensive something felt wrong against some not in any way I could articulate. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, just a persistent unease by their behavior, to hover but attributed it to coyotes or wolves. The air inside the house was always too still enough National Geographic documentaries. Sounds behaved to know that prey animals don't behave that way in one room would carry perfectly to another. They were reacting to something else from right next door, something that triggered a more primitive fear. My younger sister Madeline became a regular feature of our daily lives. Felt it too. They would appear without warning. She would sometimes stop of air so frigid they would cause your breath to mist, as if listening to something just beyond the normal drafts you'd expect in an older home. Our parents dismissed our concerns, attributing them to the natural as it travelled slowly up the main staircase to a new home. The temperature threw herself into redecorating, as if enough fresh paint and new seemed to have purpose, could mask the fundamental wrongness. They would often appear in doorways long hours in his new home office, as if standing guard firmly closed, or keeping watch. On endless conference calls, our father seemed to echo ever the pragmatist heating initially tried to find logical explanations I chose a bench for every second floor. He had always overlooking the backyard and the woods beyond. With research the previous owners had painted it a pale find him in his office that reminded me of winter skies, surrounded by printouts something about house settling seemed to repel the shadows that gathered so thickly in other parts of the house. I remember standing at my window that first in every room, watching the sun the water tested for contamination. The shadows hired a structural engineer to examine the foundation, contracting in ways that defied the normal physics of light. Each rational themselves appeared to shift until even he had viewed from different windows. Something wasn't right. I told myself this was just a became a particular source of dread. It was unfinished. None of rough stone walls. The house made unfamiliar sounds, apparently part of an older foundation groans of a the developers had built upon. But something more deliberate. The previous owners it sounded almost like conversation, leaving behind shelves of preserved just below the threshold of comprehension that we never quite got around to breakfast the next morning. The preserves laughed normal enough. But none of all houses had their quirks. But I noticed she'd already begun pricing sound dampening insulation. And Father had installed new locks on all the interior space by installing additional lights in the house. But the bulbs burned out that would become familiar regularity. Periods of relative normalcy gave up punctuated by increasingly bizarre occurrences. For a single bare bulb. I realize now that the entity shadows have taken to calling it that, though the term was during one of my rare trips to the basement, learning to retrieve holiday decorations, fears that I noticed the markings. It started they were subtle at first almost glance, playfully, like just irregularities in the stone. The first truly inexplicable event occurred, but as I traced them with my flashlight, I had developed a habit of arranging my textbooks on my desk into the foundation in precise order each worn night, by time, a small but still discernible that helped me maintain some sense of control writing system I could find in my research. One morning in late March, but they had a deliberate to find them perfectly stacked in the corner. More disturbing was their location. Their spines facing they appeared the wall. Only on stones. When I mentioned this to my mother, as if she suggested I must have moved them while studying late. Winter but I knew I had that year, but with an inevitability that felt almost purposeful. Showed no trails. The trees behind our house indicating how their leaves had been longer than those similar in the incidents forest, began occurring throughout the house, an unnaturally dense canopy that carefully arranged both light implements and sound would be found in when the leaves finally did fall. Father's important documents would vanish from his locked office, still night only to reappear days later. The sound woke us all, unmarked, a sustained smelling faintly that lasted for hours. Madeline's countless whispered conversations occurring just beyond our walls, but kept displayed on a shelf. That's when we started noticing the scratching sounds in the walls. Their heads invariably turned to attributed them to mice or squirrels. The local wildlife's behavior became increasingly erratic. But the neighbors' dogs, untouched. Three well-trained German shepherds, moving would often gather at the edge of their yards, that seemed to staring intently into the woods behind our loudest at night. Their behavior was unsettling. They would stop just for its consistency your ear to the wall, but for their complete silence from a different location, normally vocal at the slightest provocation, it was would stand rigid and silent for hours. The voices began so gradually, tracking that I sometimes wonder if they had been there all along. The cows merely waiting for us to become attuned enough to hear even they started as whispers, barely audible. They would sometimes the winter wind together in tight howls through the facing branches of defensive circles. At first, against we rationalized them as natural sounds. The farmer, Mr. Henderson, branches seemed puzzled by their behavior, but attributed it to coyotes gaps in the weather area. Or the I'd seen enough National Geographic documentaries, but there was to know an intentionality to them behave that became impossible to ignore. They were reacting to something to our conversation, something that triggered mimicking the cadence of our speech patterns, but twisted somehow. Cold spots like hearing a familiar song played in a minor key. They would appear without voices, warning, seem to take particular interest in Madeline and me. They would cause your breath sensing our youth and vulnerability. They would call our names normal drafts you'd expect in using tones and inflections that perfectly matched our parents' as it travelled slowly, but always with something subtly wrong. The temperature dropping by a slight elongation of vowels in its wake. An emphasis on the wrong seemed to have purpose. I remember one particular night would often appear in doorways or at the foot of beds. I was up late studying for finals or keeping watch. My desk positioned near the window. Our father, ever the pragmatist, the temperature tried to find logical explanations for everything. And ice crystals. He had always been the type to meet uncertainty with research seemed to shift. I would often find him in his office late at night, surrounded by around midnight. About house I heard what sounded like someone calling my name from the woods, and the voice was eerily familiar. He installed carbon monoxide detectors in every room, with an undertone that made the water tested for contamination, and even hired a structural engineer to examine the foundation. Intonation. Each investigation came back negative times during my childhood, explanation but she wanted to show me something interesting. Until even he had my actual mother was asleep in a room across the hall. I could hear the basement became a particular source of dread. Despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, I found myself drawn to the window. The moon was part of an older foundation, casting stark shadows across the snow-covered yard. The previous owners had used it my blood run cold, leaving behind shelves of preserved something moved in a way that nothing natural should move. That we never quite got around to clearing out. It was like watching a shadow detach itself from the darkness, normal enough, flowing but none of the trees could shake with liquid grace. That the content was both fascinating and deeply wrong. If we like watching a time-lapse video of decay. Mother tried to brighten the space by installing additional lighting. The movement itself, but the bulbs burned out with suspicious regularity. The thing was performing for me, putting on a show that it fully lit, I couldn't look away and settled for a single pause occasionally, seeming to gauge my reaction before continuing its impossible dance. It was during one of my rare trips to the basement horror to retrieve holiday decorations emerged that I noticed the markings. Instead, it seemed to wear them like a cloak, bending just irregularities in the stone ways that defied could have been natural wear. But as I traced them with my flashlight, when I finally managed to tear myself away from the window, symbols had been carved into the foundation stones, worn by time, using my mother's tones. They didn't match any alphabet or writing system I could find in my research, from everywhere, but they had a deliberate quality. The words were unclear, meaning, but the meaning more disturbing was their location. Mocking. They appeared. I spent the rest of the night with my back pressed against the wall, as if forming a boundary or barrier. Our house until dawn. Its winter approached slowly, the crunch of snow, but with an inevitability that felt something almost sharp against the side. The trees behind our house next morning held on to their leaves longer than those in the surrounding forest, marked the walls, creating an unnaturally dense canopy, forming patterns that reminded me of the symbols in the sound. But when the leaves finally did fall, dusted with they did so all at once. When I showed them to my father, he blamed raccoons. The sound woke us all, but his voice shook slightly as he said it. That lasted for the rest of the day, like countless whispered conversations occurring just beyond the property. That's when we started noticing the scratching sounds in the walls. They would trigger at random intervals. We attributed them to mice, illuminating empty spaces from the cold, where something had been just seconds throughout the house. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of sounds at the edge of their range, moving through the walls, quick flickers of something that seemed to follow us from room to room, like trying to see a shadow in your peripheral vision. Sometimes they would stop abruptly if you pressed your ear to the darkness, at least only to resume doubt from a different location, only confirmed as if whatever made them knew it was the incident that still haunts me most happened to my sister Madeline gradually, in the depths that I sometimes wonder if they had been there all along, our world in merely waiting for us to become attuned enough to hear all sounds. They started as except for the persistent barely audible above the winter wind, the cold that howled had become through the bare branches of the woods, seeping through the walls. We rationalized them as natural sounds, creating patches of frost on interior walls, finding its way through gaps in the weather to be natural. Or the house's Madeline had always been more sensitive to the house's peculiarities, but there was an intentionality to them. She had an artist's eye for detail. They would respond to our conversations, drawings of things mimicking the cadence of our speech patterns, or in mirrors, but twisted shapes that would vanish when anyone else tried to look. Those sketches grew increasingly disturbing, seemed to take particular interest in twisted forms, perhaps sensing our youth and vulnerability. Even on the static paper, they would call our names in the dark. The night it happened was marked by an unusual clarity that perfectly matched our parents' voices, hanging low, but always with something in the sky, subtly wrong, casting stark, a slight elongation of snow-covered landscape, an emphasis on the wrong dropped well below zero. I remember one particular night in mid-December, broken only by the occasional sharp I was up late studying for finals, splitting in the cold. My desk positioned near the window. Madeline later told me she had woken suddenly. The temperature had dropped, though she couldn't say what had roused her, and ice crystals, the wrong feeling, as intricate patterns pressed against her chest like a physical weight, seemed to shift and rearrange normally cluttered with the typical chaos of a teenager, had been meticulously arranged. I heard what sounded like someone calling my name from the woods. At precise the voice was eerily familiar, facing toward her window. It was my mother's voice, the neighbor's security light cast that made my skin through her curtains. Come but look, the shadow it projected was impossible. Using the exact form of a deer's head, complete with a massive rack of antlers during my childhood. Everything about its wanted to show me something fundamentally wrong. But my actual mother was asleep in her room across the hall. The dimensions too elongated to belong to any natural creature. Despite every instinct screaming at me to look away, I found myself drawn to the outside. The shadow remained perfectly casting stark shadows across the snow-covered yard. What I saw there made my blood run paralyzed with fear. At the edge of the shadow maintained something moved in a way that she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. It was like watching a shadow detach itself from the darkness, but then flowing between the trees, not the natural movement of a shadow. The movement was both fascinating but and deliberate turning of the head, like watching a time-lapse video of the antlers shifted and multiplied in ways that defied the movement itself, creating patterns that hurt her eyes to look at. The thing was performing. The shadow remained for exactly 3 hours. It knew I we know this because every clock in the house stopped at that moment, seeming to gauge my reaction again before only when the thing finally vanished between the trees. It didn't fade. I noticed with growing horror. It simply ceased to completely emerge from the shadow and the next, instead leaving behind to wear them like a cloak and a cold so in the darkness around itself in ways that defied physics. Madeline's window. When I finally managed to tear myself away from the window and draw the curtains, Madeline discovered that her sketchbook had been opened to a blank page. It was no longer using my mother's tone in handwriting, but instead spoke in a chorus of whispers, was written a single phrase from every later identified. The words were unclear, but the meaning felt malevolent, almost mocking. I spent the rest of the night
next
with
morning,
my back pressed
we
against
investigated
the
the
wall,
area
listening
outside
as
her
that
window.
thing circled
The
our
snow
house
below
until
was
dawn.
pristine,
its movement
unmarked
marked
by
by
any
the
tracks or
crunch of
disturbances,
snow and the
the
occasional
neighbor's
scrape
security
of something
light had burned
sharp
out,
against the siding.
its bulb not merely
The next
dead,
morning,
but
I examined
crystallized
the
from
house's
within,
exterior,
forming
deep
patterns
gouges
similar
marked
to
the
those
walls
we'd found
at
in the
irregular
basement.
intervals.
When we
forming
measured the
patterns that
angle of
reminded
where
me of
any
the
shadow
symbols
should have
in
fallen,
the basement.
we found
But
it
these were
mathematically
fresh,
impossible
still dusted with
for
powdered
anything
paint
to have
and
cast
wood.
a shadow
When I showed them
on
to my
Madeline's
father,
window,
he blamed
from
raccoons.
that position.
But his voice
More
shook
disturbing
slightly as he
were
said
the changes in
and
Madeline
he spent the
herself.
rest of the day.
The incident left her
installing
with a
motion
heightened awareness
activated
of
lights
things the rest of
around
us
the property
could barely perceive.
The lights
She began to
proved
notice
worse than the
patterns in
darkness.
seemingly
They would trigger
random
at random
events,
intervals
the way
throughout the
birds
night,
would fall silent
illuminating
in sequence
empty
as
spaces
something unseen
where something had
moved
been
through
just
the woods.
seconds before.
The subtle shifts
Sometimes
in air pressure
they would
that
catch
preceded
glimpses of
each
movement at
supernatural
the edge of their
occurrence.
range.
She started
Quick
sleeping with her
flickers of
lights
something
on,
that wasn't
though she
quite
admitted
there,
this only made
like
the
trying to see a
shadows
shadow in your
deeper and
peripheral
more
vision.
purposeful. After a week, we disconnected them. The darkness
Spring
at least
arrived
left room
that year
for
like
doubt.
a held
The
breath
lights
finally
only
released.
confirmed our
But
worst
it brought no
fears.
relief from
the
the
incident that
strangeness
still haunts
that
me
had taken
most
root in our
happened to my
lives.
sister
The
Madeline
melting snow
in the depths of that
revealed
endless
patterns
winter.
in our yard.
January had
Dead
wrapped our
patches of
world
grass
in
forming
silence.
complex
The heavy
geometric
snow
shapes
muffling
that seemed
all
to shift
sound,
position
except for
when
the
viewed from
persistent
different
whispers
windows.
from the woods.
As the days
grew
grew
longer, we
had become a
realized that
living
longer
thing,
light didn't mean
seeping
safety.
through the walls.
It just meant
our
we
furnace
could see
running
more of what
constantly,
had previously
creating
been hidden by
patches of
darkness.
frost on interior walls.
The first
that
scream
formed patterns
came on
too
an
regular
unusually
to be
mild
natural.
April evening.
Madeline
Our
had
father,
always been more
maintaining
sensitive
his
to the
habit of trying
house's
to pretend
peculiarities
everything was
than the
normal,
rest of us,
had left
She
the
had
front
an
door
artist's
open
eye
to
for
let
detail
in the spring
and kept a
breeze.
sketchbook
We were
filled with
all in the
drawings
living
of
room,
things
half
she
watching a
through
documentary
windows
about
or in
deep-sea
mirrors,
creatures,
shapes
when
that
the
would
sound
vanish when anyone else
shattered
tried
the
to
quiet
look.
night.
Those
It came
sketches
from
grew
the direction of
increasingly
the cow
disturbing as
pasture,
winter progressed,
a sound that
showing
began
twisted
almost
forms
human
that seemed
before
to shift
twisting into something that
change,
shouldn't
even on the
exist in
static
our
paper.
reality. The night it happened was
The
marked
initial
by an unusual
scream had a
clarity,
quality
the
that
moon
defied
was full,
description,
hanging low
it
and
contained
bloated
elements
in the
of a
sky,
wolf's howl,
casting
a
stark
woman's
shadows
cry,
across the
and
snow-covered
something else,
landscape.
something
The temperature
older than
had dropped
human
well
speech.
below zero. It
Creating
set off
an
an
absolute
immediate chain
stillness,
reaction.
every
Broken
dog
only
in the
by the
neighborhood
occasional
began
sharp
barking
crackle
frantically,
trees,
their
splitting
usual
in the
territorial
cold.
warnings transformed into
Madeline
sounds
later
of
told me
pure
she had
terror.
woken suddenly.
The cattle in the pasture,
though she couldn't say what had
previously
roused her.
settling down
The
for
wrong
night,
feeling
erupted
into
panic,
pressed against her
forming
chest
tight
like a
circles
circle's
with their
weight.
young in
Her
the
room,
center.
normally cluttered
But
with
worse
the
than the
typical
first
chaos
scream
of a
were those
teenager,
that followed.
had been
Each new
meticulously
cry
arranged
seemed closer
while she
than the
slept.
last.
Every
Moving in a
object
deliberate
aligned at
pattern
precise
that
right
later
angles,
mapped out,
all
a
facing toward her
spiral
window.
closing in on
The
our
neighbor's
house.
security
The sounds
light cast a
contained
harsh
layers
glow
of
through her
complexity
curtains
that
but the
shouldn't have
shadow
been
it projected was
possible from a
impossible.
single
It took the
source.
form of a deer's
Sometimes
head,
they seemed to come
complete
from
with a
multiple
massive rack
directions
of
at
antlers.
once.
As
As
if
if
everything
whatever
about its
made them
proportions
could be in
was
several
fundamentally
places
simultaneously.
wrong. The angles
The
were too
temperature
sharp,
dropped dramatically
the dimensions
as the
too
screams
elongated to
approached.
belong to any
Frost
natural
forming on our
creature.
windows despite
Most
the mild
disturbing
spring
was
air.
its solidity.
We huddled together in the
Despite
living
the
room,
wind that had
all
picked up
pretense
outside.
of
The
skepticism
shadow remained
abandoned.
perfectly
Even
still,
our father,
as if it
who
were
had
painted on the
maintained his
curtain.
rationalist stance
Madeline
through everything
lay
else,
there,
looked
paralyzed
shaken.
with fear,
His hands
as the shadow
trembled as he tried to
maintained
call
its
the
vigil.
police.
She tried
only
to convince
find
herself
that
it
every
was just
phone
her
in the house,
imagination.
cell phones
A trick
included,
of light and
displayed
wind.
the same
But then
message.
it moved.
No
Not the
signal
natural movement of a
available.
shadow
The
following
screams
its source,
continued,
but a
for
deliberate
exactly
turning of
17
the head
minutes.
to
We
face
knew
her
because every
directly.
clock in the house
The
had stopped
antlers
again,
shifted and
just as
multiplied
they had
in
during
ways that
Madeline's
defied
encounter.
physical
When they
law,
finally
creating
ceased,
patterns
the silence
that
that
hurt her
followed
eyes
was
to look
somehow
at.
worse.
The shadow
It
remained
felt for
thick,
exactly 3
expectant,
hours,
like the
we
pause
know this
between lightning
because
and
every
thunder.
clock in the house
We spent the
stopped
rest
at that
of the
moment,
night huddled together
starting
in the
again,
living room,
only
jumping
when
at
the
every
thing
creak and
finally
settling
vanished.
sound the house
It
made.
didn't fade
When
or
dawn
gradually
finally
disappear.
came,
We
it
found
simply
evidence
ceased to
that the
exist
previous
between
night
one
had
blink
been
and
a
the next,
shared
leaving
hallucination.
behind a perfect
Deep
silence
tracks marked the
and
earth
a
of our
cold
front
so
yard.
intense,
Tracks
it had
that
frosted
started
over the
abruptly in the
inside
middle of the
Madeline's
lawn
window
and disappeared just as
disappeared just as suddenly. When
They
she
resembled
finally
deer
found the
prints,
courage to
but
move,
were wrong somehow.
Madeline discovered that her
Too deep,
sketchbook
too
had been
regularly
opened to a
spaced,
blank page,
and occasionally
across
shows it
signs of
in
impossible
handwriting
angles,
that was almost
as
but
if
not quite
whatever
her
made
own,
them
would
was
bend
written a
its
single
legs in
phrase
ways
in what
that
we
would
later
shatter any
identified
earthly creature's
as Old
bones.
English. We see you seeing
More
us.
disturbing were the patterns we found drawn in the dew
The
on
next
our
morning,
windows.
We investigated the area similar to those in the basement. The snow below was pristine, covered every pane by any tracks or disturbances. They faded as the sunlight had burned out, but Madeline managed to sketch several of them, but crystallized from within, before they disappeared, forming completely similar to those later found in the basement. We would discover similar when we measured the angles where any shadow should have fallen. Described as we found it mathematically impossible for anything to have cast a shadow night of the on Madeline's window, and began researching obsessively. Driven by disturbing to understand the changes in Madeline herself, the local library became left her with a heightened awareness of things the rest of us could barely being watched. She began to notice patterns in seemingly original structures in town. The way birds would basement archives held records something dating back to the first European settlement. The subtle shifts in air pressure. My initial searches preceded each focused on the history of our property. She started sleeping with her lights on. Built in the 1990s, the shadows, but the land it stood on had a darker history. Before the subdivision was built, spring arrived that year like a held breath finally released. The family who owned no relief from the strangeness had disappeared without explanation in 1947. The melting snow, their farmhouse patterns, which had stood approximately where our house now was, forming complex geometric shapes shortly seemed to shift position. The official report blamed faulty wiring. As the days grew longer, from the time mentioned, strange symbols found carved into the foundation, we could see more of what had previously been that I now realized had been incorporated into our basement walls. The first scream came on an unusually mild April evening. I discovered that the Whitakers weren't maintaining his habit of trying to pretend everything was normal. In 1888, the front door a hunting lodge to let in near the edge of the woods. Its owner, a wealthy industrialist named Montgomery Pierce, had written extensively in his journals about shattered the quiet trees. It came from the direction of the tongues unknown to man. A sound that began almost his final entry before twisting into something that shouldn't exist in our reality. Contained a crude drawing of what appeared to be a deer-like figure. Scream had a quality that defied proportions that matched what we had seen. Elements of a Pierce and his entire household vanished during a winter storm that same year. Older than human the Native American history of the area set off an even more chain reaction. The dog in the neighborhood began barking frantically, destroyed by usual territorial warnings. I found translations of oral his sounds of that spoke of a place where the cattle in the shadows walked, previously settling down for the voices of the hungry ones into panic, echo, forming these tight circles with their young in the center, warned against building permanent structures in the first scream were describing it as a thin each new cry seemed closer than the last, worlds, moving in a deliberate pattern that we later possibilities kept surfacing closing in on our house. The Skinwalker contained layers of complexity, and the Wendigo shouldn't have been possible from a single mythology. Sometimes they seem to come from multiple directions transform into any animal, whatever seemed to fit some aspects of our experience simultaneously. The mimicry of voices dropped dramatically as the screams the sense of intelligent malice forming on our windows despite the mild spring air. We huddled together in the living room. But the Wendigo resonated more deeply with what we'd seen. Even our father, the deer-like appearance, his rational stance through the way it seemed to become more active during his hands trembled as he tried to call the perfectly with traditional Wendigo description in the house. The fact that we were in Michigan displayed the same Algonquian territory. No lent additional weight to this theory. The screams I found an academic paper from 1972 that documented similar clock in the house across the region. Dr. Eleanor Blackstone's encounter. When they finally ceased, University of Michigan, the silence that collected accounts spanning over a century. It felt thick. Her research was never published officially. Between lightning and thunder. I found we spent the rest of the night huddled together tucked away in the archives, jumping at every creek and settling Dr. Blackstone herself had disappeared while conducting field we found evidence that the previous night, leaving behind only her notes and a series of increasingly disturbing audio recordings. Tracks that started abruptly in the middle of the magnetic tape disappeared, transferred to digital they resembled dear previous archivists, but were wrong contained interviews with local residents regularly spaced experience and occasionally showing signs of impossible angles. An elderly woman describing events from her child's legs in ways that would shatter any perfectly matched what Madeline had experienced at her window. The
More
woman's
disturbing
description
were the
of the
patterns
shadows
we found
drawn
movements,
in the dew
the
on our
impossible
windows,
angles
complex
of its
symbols,
antlers,
similar
even
to
the
those
way
in
it
the
seemed to be
basement, but more
performing for
elaborate,
its audience,
covered every
all of it
pane of
aligned
glass
with our
facing the
experiences.
woods. They
in
faded
ways
as the sun
that couldn't
rose
be
higher,
coincidental.
but Madeline managed to sketch several of them in her
More
notebook
disturbing
before
were the
they
patterns that
disappeared
emerged
completely.
from these
Months
collective
later,
accounts.
we would
The
discover
incidents
similar
seemed to
symbols
follow
in
a
centuries-old
becoming more
records,
intense every
described
30
as
years.
warnings
If my
against
calculations
those who
were
walk
correct,
between shadows.
we had moved into the
After
house
the night of the
just as one of these
screams, I
cycles
began
was
researching
reaching its
obsessively.
peak.
The
Driven
previous
by a need
documented
to
cycle
understand
in
what
the
we were dealing
mid-1980s,
with. The
had culminated in the
disappearance
disappearance of 3 families
though
from
even
the
there,
area
I couldn't
within a
shake the
single
feeling of
month.
being watched.
The more
The
I
building
learned,
itself
the
was
more
old,
convinced I
one of the
became
original
that we were
structures in
dealing with
town,
something
and its
ancient
basement
and
archives
archived,
held
something that had
records
claimed
dating
the
back
woods
to the first
behind our
European
house
settlements in the
as its
area.
territory.
My
long
initial
before human
searches
settlement
focused on the
history
entity
of our property.
seemed to follow
The
rules,
house was relatively
patterns
new,
that could be
built in the
discerned if you knew where to
1990s,
look.
but the
It was
land it
bound to
stood
the
on
woods,
had a
but
darker
could influence
history.
the surrounding
Before
area.
the subdivision
It
was
seemed to
built,
gain strength
it had been
from
part
fear
of a
and
larger
attention.
farm
Yet
property.
paradoxically,
The family
sought
who
out
owned it,
witnesses
the
to its
Whitakers,
manifestations.
had disappeared without
My
explanation
research took
in
an unexpected
1947
turn when
Their
I discovered a
farmhouse,
small
which had
collection
stood
of letters
approximately
in the
where our
archives
house now
restricted
was,
section.
had
They
burned
were
to the
written
ground
in
shortly
1876
after. The
by a
official
Catholic
report
priest,
blamed faulty
Father
wiring,
Michael
but
O'Malley,
newspaper
who had
accounts
been
from
sent
the
to
time
investigate
mentioned
reports of strange
symbols
occurrences
found
in the
carved
area.
into the
His
foundation
early letters
stones.
were skeptical,
Stones
attributing
that I
the
now
incidents
realized
to mass
had been
hysteria
incorporated
or
into our
natural
basement
phenomena.
walls.
But his later correspondence
further
became
back,
increasingly
I
desperate,
discovered that the
describing
Whitakers weren't the
encounters
first
that
to
matched our
vanish
own
from that
experiences
land.
with
In
frightening
1888,
accuracy.
a hunting
Father
lodge had stood
O'Malley's
near the
final
edge of the
letter,
woods.
dated
Its
December
owner,
21st,
a wealthy
1876,
industrialist named
contained
Montgomery
a detailed
Pierce,
drawing
had written
of
extensively in his journals
identical
about
to those we found in
movements
our
in the
basement.
trees,
His
and
accompanying
voices that
notes suggested
they were meant to be
unknown to
protective
man.
wards, but
His
warned
final entry,
that they were
dated November
double-edged
13th,
swords
1888,
that could also
contained a
serve
crude
as
drawing
anchors
of what
binding
appeared to be
the
a
entity more
deer-like
firmly
figure
to our
standing
reality.
upright.
The priest
with proportions
disappeared
that matched
shortly
what
after
we had
writing this
seen.
letter.
Pierce
The
and
local
his entire
records
household
showed no
vanished
official
during a winter
investigation into
storm
his
that
fate.
same year.
The last
Native
incident
American
occurred
history of the
exactly
area
1
proved
year
even more
after the
enlightening.
first screams.
Though much of it
Despite
had
our
been
newfound
deliberately
knowledge and
obscured
precaution,
or destroyed
a
by
simple
early
oversight.
settlers,
I
the
found
front door
translations
left
of
open on
oral
a mild
histories
evening that spoke of a
invited
place
the
where
final
the shadows
confrontation.
walk. Upright, and
The screams
the voices of the
started
hungry
just
ones
as they had
echo.
before.
These
But now
accounts
they carried
consistently
purpose.
warned
The
against
sounds
building
formed
permanent
patterns
structures
we
in that area,
recognized from the ancient
describing it
texts I'd
as a
studied.
thin place,
Words in a
where the
language
boundary
too
between
old
worlds
for human
had
tongues.
worn away.
The entity moved with
Two
deliberate
possibilities
intent,
kept
starting
surfacing
from the
in my
woods,
research.
crossing the
The
cow
Skinwalker of Navajo
and approaching
legend,
our house with
and the
methodical
Wendigo
precision,
of Algonquian
standing in the living
mythology.
room.
I
The
watched through the
Skinwalker,
open
a
door,
malevolent
as
witch
it
who could
finally
transform
revealed
into
itself
any
fully.
animal.
The creature
seemed to fit
emerged
some
from the
aspects
darkness of our
like smoke
experiences,
given form.
the mimicry of
Its
voices,
body a twisted
the impossible
amalgamation of
movements,
human
the
and
sense
deer
of intelligent
features.
malice
It
behind
stood
the
impossibly
encounters,
tall,
all
its
consistent
ancestors
with
scraping against our
Skinwalker lore.
second-story
But
windows.
the Wendigo,
the moonlight
resonated
seemed to
more
bend
deeply
around
with
it,
what we'd seen
creating
and heard.
shadows
The deer-like
that moved
appearance,
independently
the
of their
screams,
source.
the way it seemed to
In that
become
moment,
more active
we
during the
understood
coldest
what the
months.
ancient texts
These aligned
meant about
perfectly with
those who
traditional
walk
Wendigo
between.
descriptions.
The entity
fact that we
existed
were in
multiple
Michigan,
dimensions
historically
simultaneously,
Algonquian
parts of it
territory,
disappearing
lent
and
additional
reappearing
weight
as
to
it
this
moved.
theory.
Its
I found an
form-defying
academic paper
physical
from
laws.
1972
Our father
that
slammed the door
documented
shut,
similar incidents
but we spent
across
that
the
night
region.
listening to it
Dr.
circle the
Eleanor
house.
Blackstone,
Its
a
claws leaving
folklore
deep
professor
grooves
from
in
the
the
University of Michigan,
The markings
had
it
collected
left weren't
accounts
random.
spanning over
They
a
matched the
century.
symbols
Her
from the
research
basement,
was never published
reversed,
officially,
as if it
the
were
paper I
unraveling
found
the ancient
was a draft
protections.
copy.
Tucked
We
away in
moved
the
out
archives
within the
restricted section.
The official
Dr.
reason
Blackstone herself
was my
had
father's
disappeared
job
while
transfer,
conducting
but we
field
all knew
research
the
in
truth.
the area.
Some places
Leaving
aren't meant for
behind
human
only her
habitation.
notes,
Some
and a series
territories
of
remain the
increasingly
domain of
disturbing
older,
audio
darker
recordings.
things.
The
that
recordings
predate
our
preserved on
civilization.
magnetic tape and transferred
Years
to
have
digital
passed,
format
but
by
the
a previous
experience has
archivist.
marked us
Contained
all.
interviews
Madeline Madeline
with
became an
local
artist
residents
about their
Her
experiences.
work filled with hidden
One account in
symbols and
particular
shadowy
stood
forms.
out.
An
An elderly
elderly
woman
woman
describing
describing
events
events
from
from
her
her
childhood
quality.
in 1923.
Our parents
that
rarely
perfectly
speak of
matched
that
what
year.
Madeline had
Though
experienced
mother
at
still
her
won't
window.
sleep in
The
rooms
woman's
with
description
uncovered
of the
windows.
shadows movements,
The house still
the
stands,
impossible angles
occupied
of its
by new
antlers,
families
even the
who
way
come
it
and
seemed
go
to be
with
performing
suspicious
for its
regularity.
audience. All of of it aligned with our experiences always during daylight hours. That couldn't be coincidental. The woods behind it seemed darker somehow, more dense, more disturbing with the patterns that emerged from these collected accounts. If I look carefully, I can see something moving between the trees. Something becoming more intense quite match the movement of the branches. If my calculations were correct, this is the first time I've written about these events. As one of these cycles was reaching putting these words to paper might attract its attention again. In the mid-1980s, the old texts had culminated in the disappearance of 3 families simply by thinking about them too intently. But the weight of keeping this secret, the more convinced I became, and perhaps that we were sharing this account will help others recognize the something that had claimed the woods behind our house. I still dream about it long before human settlement. The shadow at the entity seemed to follow screams, patterns that emerged from the darkness if you knew where to look. It was bound to the always watching, but could influence the surrounding back to those woods. It seemed to gain sometimes from fear in the moment between sleeping and paradoxically, I catch myself wanting to answer to its manifestations. My research took an unexpected turn when I discovered a small collection of letters in the archives. The late autumn wind whipped across the rolling hills of Kentucky horse country, carrying with it the Father Michael O'Malley, who had been sent to investigate reports of strange occurrences in the area. His early letters were skeptical, were casting longer shadows to mass hysteria wooden barns and frost-covered. But his later correspondence became increasingly across 800 acres describing encounters that matched our own experiences as deep as the limestone beneath our feet. Father O'Malley's final letter about the graves, December 21st, 1876, contained a detailed drawing of worn headstones dating back to the 1800s found in our others known only through carefully preserved property records and oral histories, passed down that they were double-edged swords. The owners maintained these anchors with a reverence binding the entity more firmly to our reality. Trimming the grass by hand shortly after keeping the horses away with the local fencing showed and welcoming the occasional visitor who came to lay flowers. The last incident occurred exactly 1 year after the first scream. Mrs. Helena Burton, despite our newfound knowledge the standard orientation, a simple oversight about the grave, the front door left open on a mild evening. We respect our history here, final confrontation. Her grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. The screams weathered started just as they had before. These families were here long before us. The sounds and their descendants still recognized from the ancient texts I'd studied. I'd words in a language too old little of it at the time. Tongues. Growing up in Kentucky, moved with deliberate history being starting from the woods to crossing homesteads and family plots and approaching our house with methodical precision. I was assigned to the north barn. I watched an imposing structure of hands as it finally revealed itself fully. That the creature emerged from the darkness, my barn partner, like smoke given form. Was a veteran of 15 amalgamation of human and deer knowledge of horses matched only by her efficiency. Its antlers scraping against our second-story window of the barn. The moonlight she checked the bend around the outline, creating shadows, a responsibility independently of their source. As a sign in that moment, we understood what the ancient texts meant first about weeks past, those uneventfully between. I settled into the rhythm existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The familiar disappearing and reappearing as it moved. The comfortable routine of feeding physical laws. But as November deepened and the days grew shorter, but we spent that night listening to it circle the house. Small things at first, its claws leaving deep grooves in the sound of footsteps. The markings it left weren't random. The sensation of being watched from the basement stall, but reversed. The occasional unraveling what I knew to be an empty stall. We moved out during a particularly cold morning in early December when I had my first job undeniable experience. But we all knew the sun. Some places aren't meant for human habitation. Painting some the frost-covered remained the domain of old, pale gold. Darker things. Rebecca had left to do her morning field check, civilization, leaving me alone in the barn with our single occupied stall. But the experience, a young thoroughbred recovering from a minor became an artist. Her work filled with at the far end of the barn, shadowy forms, focused on clearing the last empty stall for their otherworldly quality. 2 distinct male parents rarely speak engaged in conversation. Though mother still the acoustics of the old barn uncovered made it impossible to make out their words. Still stands, but the cadence occupied by new families, one voice who come and go, suspicious, the other lighter and deferential. Past it occasionally. My first thought was that it must be Mr. Burton. The woods behind it seemed darker somehow, making an early more dense than the surrounding forest. Brushing off my gloves.
Sometimes,
I stepped
if I
out
look
into the
carefully,
barn
I can
aisle,
see
ready
something
to greet
moving
them.
between
the
the
voices
trees.
continued,
Something
seeming
that
to
doesn't
come from the
quite
entrance
match the
about
movement
60
of the
feet away.
branches in
But
the
when I
wind.
rounded the corner,
This is the first
I found
time I'd
only
written
empty
about these
space
events and silence.
Part of me fears
The gravel drive
that putting
outside
these words
showed
to
no
paper
tire
might
tracks,
attract
no
its attention
footprints
again.
in the frost.
The old
The morning
text
was
warned
still,
that these
except for
entities
the
can be
soft
summoned
nickering
simply
of our
by
lone
thinking
horse.
about them
I
too
stood there
intently.
for several
but
long
the weight
moments
of keeping
trying
this
to
secret
rationalize
has become
what I'd
too
heard.
heavy.
The
And
wind
perhaps
playing
sharing
tricks,
this
perhaps,
account
will
will help
help
others
others carrying from
recognize
one of
the
the other
signs
barns
before
but
it's
I
too
knew
late.
with a certainty
I
that
still
settled
dream
cold
about it
in my
sometimes.
stomach, that these
The shadow at the
explanations
window,
weren't
the
sufficient.
impossible
The
screams,
voices had been too
the thing
clear,
that emerged
too
from the
present.
darkness on
That
that
incident
final
marked the
night.
beginning
In
of what
these
would become
dreams,
a
it's
regular
always
watching,
watching, waiting,
of
calling me
inexplicable
back to those
events.
woods.
A
And
few
sometimes,
days later,
in the
while
moments
taking
between
my lunch
sleeping
break
and
in the
waking,
small room
I
we
catch
used as an
myself wanting
office,
to answer.
I heard it, the distinctive sound of someone walking down the barn aisle with a lead rope. Click, click, click. The rhythm was unmistakable.
The late
to
autumn
anyone
wind
who'd
whipped
spent
across
time
the
around
rolling
horses.
hills of Kentucky
The
horse
sound
country,
of a brass
carrying
clip,
with it swaying
the first
against
bitter
itself
bite
with
of
each
winter.
step.
I
I'd been
rose from
working
my
at Willow
chair,
Creek Farm for
sandwiched
just
over
over
3 months,
and peered out
and
the office
already
window
the
that
shorter
overlooked
days
the barn
were
aisle,
casting longer
nothing,
shadows
no movement
across the
no
weathered
shadow,
wooden barns
just the
and
empty
frost-covered
corridor
paddocks.
stretching away
The
in
property
both
sprawled
directions.
across
Yet the sound
800 acres
continued
of prime
for several more
bluegrass
steps
country.
before fading
Its
away.
history,
The
as deep
incidents
as the
began
limestone
to
beneath our
multiply.
feet. The rattle of feed
I learned
buckets
early
being
on
hung
about
on
the
stall
graves.
doors.
They dotted the
3
property like
sharp
quiet
metallic
sentinels,
clasps
clicking
some
into
marked
place,
with worn
a sound
headstones
I'd heard
dating
hundreds
back
of
to the
times during
1800s.
feeding.
Others
But when I
known
went to
only
check,
through
the
carefully
buckets hung
preserved property
undisturbed
records and
exactly
oral
where I'd left
histories,
them.
passed
Sometimes
down
it was
through
the soft
generations
thud of rubber boots on
farmhands.
wooden
The
floors.
owners maintained
Other
these
times
sites with
the
the
scrape
reverence
of a
that
pitchfork
spoke of
against
old
concrete,
Kentucky values,
or the normal
trimming the
sounds of
grass
barn
by
work,
hand,
but occurring
keeping the
when no
horses
one was
away
there
with
to make
discreet
them.
fencing,
As winter
and
deepened,
welcoming the
so did my
occasional
discomfort,
visitor who
the
came
early
to lay
dark
flowers for
meant
their
spending more
long-departed
time in the
kin.
barn under
My
artificial
supervisor,
light.
Mrs.
The old
Helena
fluorescent
Burton,
fixtures
had given me
creating
the
pools
standard
of harsh
orientation
illumination
speech
separated
about the
by
graves
deeper shadows.
during my first
I began
week.
to
We
develop
respect our
habits,
history here,
keeping my
she
back
said,
to walls
her grey
whenever
hair pulled
possible,
back in a neat
glancing
bun,
over my
weathered
shoulder more
hands
frequently
clasped before
rushing
her.
through tasks
These families
in the
were
more
here long
isolated
before
areas
us,
of the barn,
and their descendants
Rebecca
still
noticed my
considered
growing
this
tension,
sacred ground,
but seemed unsurprised.
I'd nodded.
One evening,
thinking
as
little
we were
of it at the
finishing up
time.
our final
Growing
checks,
up in Kentucky,
I finally
you get used
confided
to
in
history
her
being
about what I'd been
ever-present.
experiencing.
To
We
old
sat in the
homesteads
office,
and
family
steam
plots
rising
being
from
part
our
of the
coffee
landscape.
cups as I recounted each
I was
incident.
assigned to the north barn.
Everyone who's
An
worked here long
imposing
enough
structure
has
of
stories,
hand-hewn beams
she said,
and mortared
her
stone
expression
that
thoughtful.
had stood for over
This
a
barn's
century.
been here since
My barn
1891.
partner, Rebecca
Think
Walsh,
about how many
was a
people have
veteran of
worked
15
here,
years
lived
at
here,
Willow Creek,
died
her
here.
knowledge of horses matched only
She
by her
paused,
efficiency,
considering
she
her
had
next
a habit
words.
of leaving me
Last
alone
spring
to
I was
tend to
doing
the
night
barn
check during
while she
foaling
checked the
season.
horses
There was
in the
no one
outlying
else around,
fields,
and I
a
heard what sounded like a
responsibility I
horse
initially
moving
welcomed
around in
as a
stall
sign of
12.
trust. You know, the big one at the end.
The
The
sound
first
of
few weeks
hooves on
passed
brick,
uneventfully.
rustling in straw,
I settled
even
into the
breathing
rhythm
and
of barn
snorting.
life. But that
The
stall was
pre-dawn
empty, had been for
arrivals,
weeks.
the familiar
Hasn't
scents
had
of
straw
hay
in it
and
for
leather,
years, just
the comfortable
bare brick
routine
floor.
of feeding and cleaning.
But as November
The incident
deepened
that truly
and the
shook me
days grew
occurred in
shorter,
mid-December.
I began
Rebecca
to
and
notice
I were
things.
finishing up
Small things
evening
at first,
feeds.
easily
The
dismissed.
winter night
The
already
sound of
pitch black
footsteps when I
outside
knew I
our
was alone.
islands of
The
fluorescent
sensation
light.
of being
We were
watched
discussing
while
the next
mucking
day's
stalls.
schedule.
The
when
occasion
we
both
whinnied,
heard it from what
a
I knew
woman's
to be an
laugh,
empty
clear as
stall.
day.
Coming
It was
from
during
around
a
the
particularly
corner
cold
near the
morning
tack
in
room.
early December.
It wasn't
when
a
I had my
malicious
first
sound.
undeniable
Rather,
experience.
it was light
The
and
sun
musical,
had barely
the kind of
crested the
laugh you might
horizon,
hear during a
painting
pleasant
the
conversation.
frost-covered paddocks
But
in
its very
shades of
normalcy
pale gold.
made it all
Rebecca
the more
had left
chilling
to
in
do
the
her
empty
morning
barn.
field check.
Rebecca and
leaving
I
me
exchanged
alone in the
glances,
barn with
and
our
without a
single
word,
occupied
we
stall.
both moved to
A
investigate.
young thoroughbred
The tack
recovering
room
from a
and
minor
surrounding
injury
area were empty, of course.
I was
We
at the
checked
far
every
end
stall,
of the barn,
every corner,
focused on
even
cleaning the
stepped
last
outside
empty
to
stall
scan the
when I heard
surroundings
them.
with our
Two
flashlights. distinct
The farm
male
was silent,
voices
except for the
engaged
winter
in
wind
conversation,
and the occasional
acoustics
stamp
of the old
horse's
barn
hoof.
made it impossible
"That's a
to
new
make
one,"
out their words.
Rebecca said quietly,
but the
as we
cadence was
returned to our
clear.
tasks.
One voice
Usually
deep and
it's just the men's
authoritative,
voices,
the other
or the
lighter
work
and
sounds.
deferential.
Her
My
casual
first
acceptance
thought
of
was
the
that it must be Mr.
supernatural
Burton,
occurrence
somehow
and one
made
of the
it more real,
veterinarians
more
making an early
unsettling.
morning visit.
My curiosity,
Brushing off
fueled
my
by
gloves,
equal
I
parts
stepped
fear
out into
and
the barn
fascination,
aisle,
ready to
led
greet
me
them.
to dig
The
into the
voices
farm's
continued,
history,
seemingly
assuming
The
to come
local
from the
historical
entrance about
society
60 feet
maintained
away.
extensive
But when I rounded the
records,
corner,
and the farm's
I found
current
only
owners
empty
had
space
preserved
and
many
silence.
documents
The
from
gravel
previous
drive outside
generations.
showed no
What I
tire
found
tracks, no
painted a
footprints
picture
in
of
the
life
frost.
and death
The morning
on
was
a
still,
working horse
except
farm
for the
spanning
soft
more than a century
nickering
of our lone horse.
The north barn
I stood
had
there
been
for
built by
several
the
long
Hamilton
moments,
family,
trying to
who owned
rationalize
this
what I'd
portion
heard
of what would
the
become
wind
Willow
playing
Creek
tricks,
Farm.
perhaps,
Census
or sounds
records
carried
showed
from
a
one of the other
constant stream of
barns.
workers
But
living
I
on the
knew
property,
with a
grooms,
certainty
trainers,
that settled
stable
cold
hands
in my stomach,
death
that
certificates
these
revealed
explanations
accidents,
weren't
illnesses,
sufficient.
lives
The
lived
voices
and
had
ended
been
among
too
these
clear,
very
too
stalls,
present.
where I now
That incident
worked.
marked the
One
beginning
account
of what would
particularly
become a
caught my
regular
attention.
occurrence
A notation
of
from
inexplicable
1923
events.
about
A
a
few
young
days
woman
later,
named Margaret,
while taking my
who
lunch
worked
break
as a
in the
trainer's
small room
assistant.
we used
She
as
was
an office.
described as
I
having
heard
a
it,
memorable
the
laugh,
distinctive
and
sound
being
of someone
especially
walking
good
down the
with
barn
difficult
aisle
horses.
with a lead rope.
She died
Click,
of
click,
influenza
click.
that
The
winter.
rhythm was
and according to the
unmistakable to anyone
records,
who'd spent
was
time
buried in
around
one of the
horses.
small family
The sound of
plots
a
on the
brass
property.
clip swaying against itself
As winter
with each
progressed,
step.
the
I
activity
rose
in the
from my
barn
chair,
seemed to increase.
sandwich forgotten.
The sound
and peered
became
out
more
the office
frequent,
window that
and new
overlooked the barn
manifestations
aisle
began to appear.
Nothing, no movement,
The most significant
shadow,
was the
just
shadow
the empty
figure I
corridor
glimpsed
stretching
one
away
evening
in both
while closing
directions.
up. Yet the sound continued.
I was walking down
for
the
several
center
more steps
aisle,
before fading
checking
away.
that all the stall
The
doors were
incidents
secured.
began to multiply.
When movement caught
the
my
rattle
eye,
of feed
at the
buckets
far
being hung
end
on
of
the
stall
barn,
doors,
silhouetted
three
against the
sharp
security
metallic
light
clasps
that
clicking
illuminated
into
the
place,
entrance.
a sound
A
I'd heard
dark
hundreds
figure
of times
moved
during
across the
feeding.
doorway.
But when I
It
went
was
to check,
distinctly
the buckets
human in
hung
shape,
undisturbed,
but seemed to lack
exactly
any
where I'd
detail.
left them.
Sometimes
black silhouette
it was the soft
that passed
thud
from
of
one
rubber
side of
boots
the
on
door
wooden
to the other in a
floors.
smooth,
Other times,
silent
the scrape
motion.
of a pitchfork
My
against
first
concrete
instinct was to call
or
out,
the normal
thinking
sounds
it might
of
be
barn
another
work.
worker.
But
But
occurring
something
when
stopped
no
me.
one was there to
Perhaps
make
the
them.
absolute
As winter
silence of the
deepened,
movement,
so did
or
my
the way the
discomfort.
figure
The
seemed
early
too
darkness
dark,
meant
too
spending
solid
more time
against
in the
background
barn
under artificial
I stood
light,
frozen,
the
watching
old
as
fluorescent
the shadow
fixtures
passed back
creating
across the
pools
doorway
of
in the
harsh
opposite
illumination,
direction,
separated
then simply
by deeper
ceased
shadows.
to be. I began to develop habits. That was the
Keeping my
moment I
back to
truly
walls
understood
whenever
why
possible,
people speak of their
glancing
blood
over my
running
shoulder
cold.
more frequently,
I felt a physical
rushing
chill
through tasks
spread
in the
through
more
my body.
isolated areas
My
of the
hands
barn.
trembling.
Rebecca
as I
noticed
fumbled
my
for my
growing
phone
tension,
flashlight,
but seemed
the barn
unsurprised.
entrance, when I finally gathered
as we
the
were
courage
finishing
to
up our
investigate,
final checks,
was empty and
I finally
undisturbed.
confided
As
in
I
her
write this
about
now,
what I'd been
several months
experiencing.
have passed
We sat in the
since my
office,
first encounters
steam
with the
rising
unexplained
from our
at
coffee
Willow
cup
Creek
farm
as I
the
recounted
incidents
each incident.
continue.
Though
Everyone
they've taken
who's
on a
worked here
different
long enough
character
has
in
stories,
my mind.
she
What
said,
once
her
inspired
expression
fear,
thoughtful.
now prompts
This
a
barn's been
complex
here since
mixture of
1891.
emotions. Respect,
Think about how many
curiosity,
people have worked
and
here,
a deep
lived
awareness
here,
of the layers
died
of
here.
history that surround us.
I've learned to coexist
considering her next
with the
words.
echoes of the
Last
past
spring I
that
was doing
linger
night
in the
check
north
during foaling
barn.
season.
There
There was
was
no
no
one
one
else
around.
around.
The footsteps,
and I heard
the
what
phantoms
sounded like a
sounds of
horse
daily
moving
work.
around in stall
They've become
12.
part of the barn's character,
the big one
as
at the
much a
end,
part of its
the sound
identity
of hooves
as
on
the
brick,
weathered beams
rustling in straw,
and worn
even
floorboards.
breathing and snorting.
Even the shadow
But that
figure,
stall was
while
empty,
still
had been for
unsettling,
weeks.
seemed
Hasn't had
less
straw in it for
malevolent
years
than it
just
did at
bare
first.
brick floor. Perhaps just another echo of
The
someone
incident
going
that
about
truly
their
shook me
duties.
occurred in
Caught
mid-December.
in an
Rebecca
endless
and I
loop
were
of
finishing
time.
up evening
Rebecca
feeds.
tells me this
The winter
acceptance
night
is
already
common among
pitch black
long-term workers
outside
at
our
Willow Creek.
islands of fluorescent light.
The way I see
we
it,
were discussing
she
the
said
next
recently,
day's schedule.
they're just
when
doing
we
what
both
we're doing.
heard it.
Taking
A
care
woman's
of the
laugh,
horses, keeping
clear
the
as
barn
day,
running,
coming
They're
from
just
around
doing
the
it from
corner
their
near the
side of
tack
time.
room.
The
It
graves
wasn't a
scattered
malicious
across the
sound.
property have
Rather,
taken on
it
new
was
significance for
significance
me.
I
The
find
kind of
myself
laugh you
paying
might
more
hear during
attention
a
to them
pleasant
during my
conversation.
daily rounds.
But its very
Noting the
normalcy
names and
made it all
dates,
the more
wondering
chilling
about
in
the
the empty
lives
barn.
they represent.
Rebecca and I
Sometimes
exchanged
when I hear
glances,
those phantom
and without
footsteps
a
or
word,
distant voices,
we both moved
I
to
imagine I'm
investigate.
sharing the space with
The tack
those who
room
came
and
before.
surrounding area
All
were
of us
empty, of
connected
course.
by our
We
devotion
checked
to
every
these
stall,
magnificent
every
animals,
corner,
and
even
this
stepped
historic
outside to
place.
scan the surroundings with
The
our flashlights.
Experience has taught me something about the nature of
except for the
fear
winter wind
and
history
and the occasional
or
stamp
terror
of a
stamp at
horse's
first.
hoof. The unknown,
That's
the
a new one,
inexplicable,
Rebecca
can
said
become
quietly as we
almost
returned to
comfortable
our tasks.
when we accept
Usually
it as part of a
it's just the
larger
men's
story.
voices,
The North
or the
Barn's
sounds.
ghosts, if that's
A
what they
casual
are,
acceptance of
seem
the
less like supernatural invaders
somehow made it
and more
real,
like co-workers from
more
a different
unsettling.
era.
My
Their
curiosity,
routines and responsibilities
fueled by equal
echoing
parts
through
fear
time
and
fascination
alongside
led me
our
to
own.
dig into the farm's history.
As winter
The
gives way
local
to spring,
historical society
I find myself
maintained
wondering what new
extensive
experiences
records,
await
and the
in the
farm's
North
current
Barn.
owners.
The
have
activity
preserved
seems
many
to ebb and
documents from
flow with
previous
the seasons,
generations,
but it
what
never
I found
entirely ceases.
painted a
Like
picture
the
of
graves
life
that
and
dot the
death
property,
on a working
like the
horse
ancient
farm
limestone
spanning more
beneath
than a
our
century.
feet. Like the very walls of the barn had been
itself,
built by the Hamilton
these
family,
manifestations
who owned
have
this
become
portion
part of the landscape
what would become
of my daily
Willow
life.
Creek Farm.
A
Census
reminder
records
that
showed
in
a
places
constant
with
stream
deep
of workers
history,
living on the property.
past is never
Grooms,
truly
trainers,
past,
stable hands,
but continues to
death
resonate in
certificates
ways
revealed
both
accidents,
subtle and
illnesses,
profound.
lives lived and ended among these very stalls where I now worked. One account particularly caught my attention. A notation from 1923
Summer in
about a
Tennessee
young woman
hits
named
different
Margaret,
when you're 13.
who had worked as a
The
trainer's
air
assistant.
hangs thick
She
and
was
heavy,
described as
like a
having
wet
a
blanket
memorable
draped
laugh
across your shoulders,
and being
and the
especially
cicadas
good
with
screamed
difficult
their
voices.
endless chorus.
She
into
died
the
of
suffocating
influenza
heat.
that winter.
It was June
and according to the
2010,
records,
was
when my
buried
mother
in
drove
one of
me
the
to Camp
small
Buckton's,
family plots
her
on the
hands
property.
gripping the steering wheel with that
As winter
determined
progressed,
set to her jaw.
the activity in the
barn
barn
seemed to increase.
She'd been pushing the Boy
The
Scouts
sounds
thing
became
since
more
Dad
frequent,
left,
and new
convinced it would
manifestations
build
began to appear.
character.
The
I
most
didn't have the heart to tell her
significant
I'd
was the
rather
shadow
spend my
figure
summer
I
anywhere
glimpsed
else.
one evening while
Camp
closing up.
Buckton's sprawled
I was
across
walking
several
down the
hundred
center
acres
aisle,
of dense Tennessee
checking that all the
wilderness,
stall doors
about
were
2
secured.
hours east of Nashville.
When movement caught
the main
my eye,
entrance was
at
marked
the
by
far
a
end
weathered
of the
wooden
barn,
sign,
silhouetted
its
against
carved
the
letters
security light
spelling out the
that
camp's
illuminated
name
the entrance.
beneath the Boy Scouts
A dark
emblem.
figure moved
As we
across
pulled
the
into the
doorway.
gravel parking
It was
lot,
distinctly
I watched
human
other
in
kids
shape,
spilling
but
out
seemed
of
to
their
lack any
parents'
detail.
cars. Their green
Just a black
uniforms,
silhouette
crisp and new
that
looking,
passed from
compared
one
to
side
my
of the
hand
door
to
to
the
the
other in a smooth,
"You'll do great,
silent
Brian,"
motion.
Mom said,
My
squeezing
first
my
instinct
shoulder.
was to
Troop
call out,
417 has
thinking
been
it might
coming
be
here for
another
years,
worker.
but
Mr.
something
Walsh
stopped me.
says it's the
Perhaps
best
the
scout camp
absolute
in the
silence
state.
of the movement,
I
or
nodded,
the way the
not
figure
trusting
seemed
myself
too
to
dark,
speak.
too
The truth
solid
was,
against the
everything
background
about
light.
this place
I
set
stood
my
frozen
teeth on
watching
edge.
as
Maybe
the
it
shadow
was the way
passed
the
back
dense
across the
forest
doorway
pressed
in the
in
opposite direction,
around the clearing,
then simply
or how the
ceased
shadows
to
seemed to
be.
move when you weren't looking directly at them.
That was the moment
Even
I
from the
truly
parking
understood
lot,
why people
I could
speak
tell the
of their
buildings
blood
were
running
spread
cold.
far apart.
I felt a physical
connected by
chill
winding
spread
trails
through my body
that disappeared
my hands
into the
trembling
undergrowth
as I
Our
fumbled
troop
for my
gathered
phone's
near the
flashlight.
registration
The
cabin,
barn
where
entrance,
Mr. Walsh,
and
our
I
scoutmaster,
finally gathered the
was
courage
checking
to
us in.
investigate.
There were
Was
15 of
empty
us
and
total,
undisturbed,
mostly kids
as I
knew
write
from
this
school.
now. Though
Several
none I'd
months had
called
passed
close friends.
since my first
The air
encounters
smelled
with the
of pine
unexplained
needles
at Willow
and
Creek
decay.
Farm.
That
The
peculiar
incidents
mustiness
continue,
that
though
rises
they've
from the
taken on a
forest floor
different
in
character
summer.
in my mind.
Listen
What
up,
once
boys,
inspired fear,
Mr. Walsh
now
called
prompts
out,
a
his
complex
clipboard
mixture
tucked
of
under one
emotions.
arm. We're in
Respect,
Campsite Delta,
curiosity,
about a quarter
and
mile
a
from
deep
here.
awareness
Bathroom
of the layers of
facilities are
history
shared
that
with
surround
3
us.
other sites.
I've learned to
located at the
coexist
trail junction
with the echoes
Showers
of the
are
past
another 5
that
minutes
linger in
past
the
that.
north barn.
Remember the buddy
The
system.
voices,
Nobody
the
goes
footsteps,
anywhere alone,
the phantom sounds
especially
of daily
after
work.
dark.
They've
As we
become
hiked to
part
our
of the
campsite,
barn's
I
character,
couldn't shake the
as
feeling
much a
that
part of
something
its
was wrong.
identity.
The woods
as the
were
weathered
alive with
beams
normal summer
and worn
sounds.
floorboards,
Birds
even
calling,
the shadow
leaves
figure,
rustling,
while still
distant
unsettling,
shouts from other
seems
campers.
less malevolent
But underneath
than
it
did
all
at first.
was a tension
Perhaps
I
just
couldn't
another
explain.
echo,
Like the
of
forest
someone
itself
going
was
about
holding
their
its
duties,
breath,
caught in an
the initial
endless
day
loop
passed
of
in a
time.
blur of setup
Rebecca
and
tells me
orientation.
this acceptance
We pitched
is
our
common
tents in
among
a clearing
long-term
ringed
workers
by
at Willow
towering
Creek.
oaks.
Their branches
The way I
creating
see
a
it,
natural
she
canopy
said recently,
that filtered the
they're
sunlight
just doing
into
what we're
shifting
doing,
patterns on
taking
the ground.
care of the horses,
air was
keeping the
thick
barn
with
running.
humidity.
They're just
and by
doing it
evening,
from
their
their side
uniform
of
was
time.
stuck to my
The
back
graves
with sweat.
scattered across the property
It was during the
have
walk
taken
to the
on
mess
new
hall for
significance
dinner
for
that I
me.
first
I
noticed
find
it.
myself paying
The
more attention
sensation
to
of
them
being
during my
watched.
daily rounds.
We were moving in a
noting
group,
the names
following
and
the
dates,
marked trail,
wondering about the
when the
lives
feeling
they
hit me,
represent.
like a physical
Sometimes when
weight
I hear
between
those
my shoulder
phantom
blades.
footsteps or
I
distant
stopped,
voices,
turning to look
I
behind
imagine
me,
I'm sharing
but there
the
was
space
nothing
with
there
those who
except
came before.
shadows and trees.
All of us connected
Keep
by
up,
our
Ryan.
devotion to
Mr.
these
Walsh called from the front of the group.
and
Don't
this
want to miss
historic
hot dog
place.
night?
I hurried to
The
catch up,
experience
but the
has taught me
feeling
something about the
persisted.
nature
It
of
wasn't
fear
like being
and
watched
history.
by a person.
What terrifies
This
us
felt
at
older,
first,
colder,
the unknown,
something
the
that didn't think
inexplicable,
quite like we
can
did.
become almost
I tried to
comfortable
rationalize
when
it
we
as normal
accepted
would
as part of a
induce
larger
paranoia.
story. The kind
The
of thing
North
that
Barn's
happens to
ghosts,
city
if
kids
that's what they
when
are,
they're suddenly
seem
surrounded
less
by
like
wilderness.
supernatural invaders,
but deep down,
and more like
I knew it
co-workers
was
from a
something
different
else.
era. Their routines and responsibilities echoing
building
through
with
time,
screened windows
alongside
and fluorescent
our own.
lighting that made everyone look
As
slightly
winter gives
sick.
way to spring,
I sat with my
I
troop,
find myself
picking
wondering
at my
what
hot
new
dog,
experiences
while
await in the
conversations
North
flowed
Farm.
around me.
The
From our
activity
table,
seems to
I
ebb
could
and
see
flow
into the
with the
woods through
seasons,
the screens,
but it never entirely
where the darkness
ceases.
was gathering
Like the
between
graves
the
that
trees,
dot the property,
like spilled ink.
like the ancient limestone beneath
Did you
our
guys
feet,
notice anything
like
weird
the very
on the
walls
trail?
of the barn
I
itself?
asked Kevin, the kid
These
sitting next to me.
manifestations
He looked up
have
from
become
his
part
food,
of the
confused.
landscape of my daily
Weird
life.
how?
A reminder
I
that
struggled
in
to put it
places
into
with
words,
deep history,
like something
the past
watching
is
us.
never truly
It's the
past,
woods, man,
but
he
continues to
laughed. Probably
resonate
just
in
deer or
ways
something.
both
My
subtle
dad
and
says this
profound.
place is full of them, but it wasn't deer. I knew what deer felt like. I'd been hunting with my uncle enough times. This was different. This felt intelligent. Summer in Tennessee hits different. The second day brought archery practice. The air and hangs thick and heavy. Normal like a wet blanket draped across your shoulders, boring, and the cicadas screamed their feeling of wrongness into the suffocating heat. During June 2010, I kept seeing movement at the edge of my mother drove me to Camp Buckton's. Darting shapes, hands gripping when I tried to focus on them. With that determined set must have noticed my distraction because he pulled me aside pushing the Boy Scouts after I missed my fifth shot in a row. Convinced it would build everything okay, son? I didn't have the heart to tell her I'd rather spend my summer anywhere else. You seem a bit jumpy today. Sprawled across several hundred acres of dense Tennessee wilderness, about the way the woods went quiet when you walked alone. The main entrance was marked by a weathered hunted sign. Instead, I carved letters spelling out the camp's name beneath the Boy Scouts emblem. None of us. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, the night had been filled with strange sounds, spilling rustling around their tent cars. Soft, their green uniforms crisp and new-looking compared to my hand breathing right outside the thin nylon wall by my head. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out with my flashlight, has been coming here for years. There was nothing there except it's the best scout camps in the state. During the afternoon not trusting myself to speak, I hung toward the middle of the group, everything about this place set the way the trees seemed to lean in, the way the dense forest pressed in, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers, or how the shadows seemed to move. The guide was pointing out different types of local flora, even from the parking lot. His words. I could tell the feeling of being watched had become constant, connected by winding trails my shoulder blades that disappeared into the away. Our troop gathered near the registration camp, everything where Mr. Walsh, our scoutmaster, was checking us in. Sticky. There were 15 weather that makes you feel dirty. I knew from no matter what you do. Though none I'd call close friends. Mr. Walsh announced the air smelled of pine needles and most of the troop headed out together. But I hung back that rises from the forest floor in the thought of the communal showers. Listen up, boys. I'll wait. Mr. Walsh called out, his clipboard tucked under one arm. We're in Campsite Delta, about a quarter mile from here. That's fine, Ryan. Bathroom facilities are shared with 3 other sites. You'll have to go alone at the trail junction. But what about the buddy Showers system? Are another 5 minutes past that. Remembering his own the buddy system from the first day. Nobody goes anywhere alone. We have to make exceptions. As we hiked to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods were alive with normal summer sounds. I waited in the empty campsite, watching the sun sink lower, leaves rustling. When the rest shouts from other campers, chattering and but underneath it all was already was a tension I couldn't explain. The shadows were long like the forest itself was and the woods had taken on that peculiar quality. The initial day passed in a blur of familiar shapes become strange and we pitched our tents in a clearing ringed by towering towel. Their branches creating a natural canopy. The distance filled the shower building seemed longer now that I was alone. The air was thick with humidity into the gathering darkness. My uniform was stuck to my back as I wept, trying to fill the silence to the mess with something human that I first noticed. Stupid. The sensation of being watched. We were moving in regular old Tennessee following the marked trail, but they weren't when the feeling hit me anymore. Like a physical normal evening sounds, shoulder blades, the chirping of crickets, the turning to look behind me, but there was nothing there. Small animals in the underbrush trees had gone completely silent. Mr. Walsh called from the front of the group. Don't want to miss hot dog night like cotton wool. I hurried to catch up, but only by the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't like being watched. I was about halfway to the showers felt old when I heard it. Something that didn't think quite like we did. Like someone trying to breathe through a mouthful of woods-induced paranoia. It came from somewhere the kind of thing that happens in the deeper shadows between the trees. Suddenly surrounded by wilderness. Moving of their own accord. Deep down, every muscle in my body going rigid with primal fear. The mess hall was a long, low sound came again, screened windows, closer now, and accompanied by the snap of a branch everyone and the rustle of leaves. Sick. I sat with my troop through the picking at my hot dog, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. From our rational part I could see into the woods through the screens. Not a deer, the darkness was gathering between the trees. Not a bear too quiet, not a person. Did you guys notice anything weird on the trail? All wrong. I asked Kevin, the kid sitting next to me. Loomed ahead. He looked up from his food, concrete walls pale in the dying light. Weird how? I hit the door at full speed, yanking it open and diving inside. Like something the fluorescent lights flickered. It's the woods, man. Casting harsh shadows. Probably just deer or something. My dad says this place is full of looking for somewhere to hide. The shower stalls themselves were just been hunting with my uncle enough no times. Good. But this was different. In the corner, this felt intelligent. Was a supply closet for towels and the second day brought archery practice. I squeezed inside, pulling the door shut. Normal scout activities the space should have been boring, barely big enough for me to stand. The feeling of wrongness intensified.
During archery, I kept seeing movement at the edge of the range. I could see a slice of the main room that vanished when I tried to focus on them. The instructor must have noticed there was nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat thundering after I missed my fifth shot. Then the outer door creaked open. Everything what entered the shower building wasn't human. His weathered face movements were too fluid, too wrong. You seem a bit like watching a spider move in stop motion. I wanted to tell him about the shadows, maybe 7 feet, about the way the woods went quiet when you pale skin stretched tight, about the feeling of being hunted, where its face should have been. Instead, I just shrugged. There was a nightmare. Tired, sir. No sleep, revealing blackened gums and teeth that looked like they had been stained. The night had been filled with strange sounds. God, rustling around the tent, looking into empty wells, scratching noises, bottomless and hungry. What sounded like creature moved right through the shower room in a series of jerky, unsettling motions. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out from side to side like a bird, there was nothing there except deep claw marks in the dirt, ended in long. During the afternoon nature hike, that clicked against the tile floor as it walked, trying to ignore the way the trees seemed to lean a steady tap over the trail. Made my skin their branches reaching like pressed myself further back into the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible. My lungs were burning. I realized I'd been holding my breath. The feeling of being watched had become constant. Its head snapping toward the closet between my shoulder blades that wouldn't go away. It had to know. Those empty eyes seemed to stare directly at my hiding place. The day itself I could smell it hot and sticky, a sickly kind of weather that makes you feel dirty. Something else, no matter what you do. Something chemical. After dinner, Mr. Walsh announced the step toward the closet. Then another. Most of the troop headed out together, but I hung back. My stomach churning at the thought that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its chest. I'll wait. My vision started to blur with tears I refused to let fall, his face knowing that any sound might give me away. Then, unexpectedly, voices echoed from outside. You'll have to go alone. Another group of scouts heading to the showers. I protested, the creature's remembering his own warnings from the first day. And with a movement too quick to follow, sometimes it was gone. We have to make the outer door hadn't even opened, he said. It was just there one moment and just don't take too long. Be back before full dark, fading in the morning light. The empty campsite. I stayed in that closet for what felt like hours. When the rest of the troop returned, chattering and my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shadows were long finally entered, and the woods had taken on that peculiar quality they get at dusk. After what I'd witnessed, where familiar shapes scoutmaster found me when he heard movement in the closet, gathering my shower supplies and to catch someone I set playing on the trail. The distance to the shower building seemed longer now that I was alone. When he saw my state, each step taking me deeper into the gathering darkness. Could barely shake my head myself as I walked. He must have seen something in my face that worried him, because he immediately took charge of the situation. Nothing to leading me to the private shower, just regular old Tennessee woods. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. Couldn't find the normal evening sounds, the chirping of crickets, the calls of night birds, back to my own campsite, the rustle of small animals in the scoutmaster insisted on accompanying me, silent, probably thinking I'd had some kind of panic attack, pressing against my ears like cotton wool. But I knew what I'd seen, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, with the same certainty that I was about halfway to the showers when I got back to my tent. A low, I didn't sleep sound. I lay like someone trying to breathe through a mouthful of fluid, jumping. It came from somewhere off to my left. Somewhere in the distance, I heard that same raspy growl. My feet stopped moving of their own accord. Farther away now. Every muscle in my body had found other prey to hunt. Primal fear. The next morning, again, I called my mother from the camp accompanied by the snap. I told her I was sick and the rustle that I needed to come home. Something was moving. She must have heard something in my voice, something that didn't care about being quiet anymore. Didn't try to convince the rational part of my brain tried to. She arrived 2 hours later, not a deer, to pick me up. Too deliberate. As we drove away from camp, but too quiet. I watched the trees through the car window. Was wrong. Something moved in the shadows of the forest. The shower building loomed ahead, pale. Its concrete walls pale in the dying light. For a moment. I hit the door at full speed, yanking it open and diving inside. What happened that night. The fluorescent lights the Boy Scouts the following week, casting harsh and she didn't fight me on that either. My eyes darted around looking for somewhere to still think about what I saw. The shower stalls themselves would just open sometimes on dark nights, but when the wind moves through the trees was a supply closet for towels and cleaning supplies. And I squeezed inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. Then the space was seen what I saw, barely big enough for me to stand, those empty eyes watching watching them from the shadows. Through a crack, because I know the door hadn't quite closed properly. Waiting in those I could see a slice of the main waiting for someone else to walk alone in the gathering dark. For 2 minutes, there was nothing but the sound of my own heart. And if you ever find yourself at Camp Bucktum's, remember the outer door creaked when the woods go quiet. What entered the shower building was eyes on your back. Its movements were too fluid. They say that's when it likes to chase. Like watching a spider move calmly back to your campsite. It was tall, back to the lights maybe and the voices and the possibility of numbers. It's pale, whatever you do, don't tight over jutting bones. Because sometimes, it's closer than you nightmare. No lips, revealing blackened gums and teeth that looked like they had been stained with rust. Its eyes. God, its eyes growing up looking into the bustling heart of a major metropolis and hungry. I never expected to encounter through the shower room in a series concrete of jungle of skyscrapers and neon lights twitching from side to side like a bird for ghostly apparitions. Its hands or paranormal activity. Yet, as I would come to learn, curved claws, the veil between our world and the tiled floor is thin everywhere. The sound even in the most unlikely building place. A steady tap 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 that made my skin crawl. And I pressed myself further back into the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible. My lungs were burning. My mother I realized I'd been holding my breath. Like a crescent the thing paused. It wasn't until I was toward the closet that I realized this seemingly innocuous mark it knew was far more than a simple those empty eyes seemed to stare directly at my hiding place. It was a sign of something much deeper, much more ancient, a sickly, sweet odor of decay, or perhaps a curse, something else that ran through the women in my family. The creature took a step toward the closet, then another. So did my great-great-grandmother Beatrice. It was a pattern that repeated itself, that generation after generation, deep inside skipping one, and my vision started to blur with tears. With the mark came an ability that defied knowing that any sound might give me away, if you will. Then that allowed us to perceive things beyond echoed from outside of another group of scouts heading to the showers. Growing up, the creature's head whipped towards this gift from my mother, and with a movement too quick to follow, they spoke in hushed tones about the outer door hadn't even uncanny ability. It was just there one moment and gone the next, that others couldn't. Like a nightmare. As a child, fading in the morning light. I dismissed these stories as nothing more than family folk felt like ours. The kind of tales that get passed down, and my breath coming in short of shallow gasps. How wrong I was. When the other troop finally summer of 2002, teenage when I first realized that there was more to these stories than the scoutmaster found me when he heard movement in the closet, probably in a modest apartment on the 17th floor of a high-rise in the city center. Concern evident in his voice when he saw my state. Child, are you all right? Friends, I couldn't speak, could barely shake my head. But as night fell, must have seen something in my face that worried itself to me. Because he immediately our apartment wasn't large, but it felt cavernous leading me to the private shower. The hallway that connected the bedrooms to the living area. I didn't tell him what I'd to stretch on forever. Couldn't find the words to describe it in the corners and doorways. It was in this corridor my own campsite that I first saw them. The scoutmaster insisted on accompanying for years to probably thinking I'd had some kind of panic first encounter. Maybe I had. It was a warm night in July, and I was gotten up to get a glass of water. With the same certainty that I knew down the hallway, my small feet when I got back to my tent on the carpet. I didn't sleep. I saw something move, listening to the sounds out of the corner of my eye. Jumping at first, I thought it was my father. Somewhere in the distance, I heard that same raspy growl in the early hours. But it seemed farther away now, as I turned as if the thing had found other prey to hunt. Sense of dread that this was not my father at all. I called my mother from the camp office. I told her I was sick, that I needed to come home. The ceiling. She must have heard something in my voice, not just in color, but in substance, because she didn't argue, as if it were made of convince me to give it form. She arrived with 2 hours later to pick me up. Like we drove away from Camp Bucktum's, I watched the trees and through the car window. God, its eyes. Something moved. They were hollow pits of absolute darkness. Something tall, seeming to draw in what little light there was pace with the car for a moment. Before falling behind, frozen in terror, unable to move or cry out. I quit the Boy Scouts the following week, seem to notice and she didn't fight me on continuing its bizarre silent dance down the hallway. But then slowly its head turned towards me. Those bottomless eyes, sometimes on dark nights, and I felt a chill that went beyond the trees, just cold. It was as if my very soul was being touched by something ancient. And I wonder about all the other kids who've gone to Camp Bucktum after what felt like an eternity. If they've seen but was probably only a few seconds. If they felt the figure turned away, watching them from the shadows journey. Because disappearing into the shadows at the end of the hall, deep woods. I ran back to my room, for someone else, diving under the covers and squeezing my eyes shut to pray that when I far enough from safety, the world would make sense. And if you ever find yourself at Camp Bucktum's, remember this: that was just the woods go quiet. Night after night, feel those eyes on you. your back.
Shadow figures.
Don't run.
They say that's
growing,
when it
their
likes to
silent
chase.
movements becoming
Just
more
walk calmly
frenzied.
back to your
And as my
campsite,
fear grew,
back to the lights
so
and the
did my
voices
understanding
and the safety
that I
of
was
numbers.
witnessing
And
something
whatever
that
you do,
others
don't
could
look
not
behind
see.
you. Because
The
sometimes
first manifestation of a gift
closer
that
than you
would
think.
change my life forever. As the weeks turned into months, and months into years, the nightly visitations
Growing
became a
up in the
terrifying
bustling
routine.
heart of a
Every
major
evening,
metropolis,
as the
I
sun
never
dipped
expected
below
to
the
encounter
horizon and the city
the
lights
supernatural.
flickered to life,
The
I
concrete
would feel
jungle
the
of
familiar
skyscrapers
dread
settling
neon
in the
lights
pit of my stomach.
seemed an unlikely
The shadows
backdrop
would
for
come
ghostly
without
apparitions
fail,
or
their
paranormal
silent
activity.
parade, a macabre
Yet as I would
spectacle
come to learn
that only I
the
could
veil
witness.
between our
My
world and the
days
next
were
is
normal
thin
enough.
everywhere.
I'd wake up,
even in the
have
most
breakfast with my
unlikely
dad
of
before he
places.
went to sleep,
My
and then
name
head
is
off to
Isabella.
school.
My
My
mother
mother
would
would
pick
pick
me
me
up
up
in
in
the
the
afternoon
afternoon,
on my right cheek,
and we'd spend a
small
few hours together.
reddish
Before
splotch
my father
that
woke
my
up
mother
to
always
start his
said
night shift.
looked like a
It was
crescent
a life
moon.
of clockwork
It wasn't until I
precision.
was older
Each day
that I
flowing
realized
into
this
the next
seemingly
with
predictable
predictable
regularity
was far
but
more
as
than a
night
simple
fell,
quirk
that
of
comforting
pigmentation.
routine
It
would
was a
shatter.
sign of
The
something
first
much
sign was
deeper,
always
much
a
more
drop in
ancient,
temperature,
a gift,
even on the
or
hottest
perhaps
summer
a
nights.
curse.
I'd
The
feel a
grand
chill
chill
creep
creep
into
into
my
the
family,
room.
raising goosebumps
My
on
grandmother
my arms
Evelyn had
and
the
sending
same mark.
shivers down
So
my
did my
spine.
great-great-grandmother
Then
Beatrice.
the shadows would
It was a
begin
pattern
to
that
move.
repeated itself.
It always started
generation
in the
after
hallway,
generation,
a flicker of
skipping
movement,
one,
barely
and manifesting in
perceptible
the
at
next.
first.
With
Like
the
a
mark
curtain
came an ability
stirring in
that
a
defied
non-existent
explanation,
breeze,
a
then
sixth
slowly
sense, if you
the
will,
shadows would
that allowed
coalesce
us to
taking on
perceive
those
things
familiar,
beyond the
terrifying
realm
forms,
of ordinary
tall,
human experience.
impossibly thin
Growing
figures.
up, I'd
Their
heard
bodies
whispers
seeming
of this
to bend
gift
from
and
my
sway
mother
in
and
ways
aunts.
that defied
They spoke
physics.
in hushed
Their
tones
faces
about Grandma
if you could
Evelyn's
call them that,
uncanny
were
ability
featureless,
to
save
sense
for those
spirits,
haunting hollow
to see things
eyes.
that others couldn't.
At first,
as a
there
child,
was just one.
I dismissed
It would
these
glide
stories
down the hallway,
as nothing more than
passing by
family
my
folklore.
partially open door.
The kind of tales
Its gaze
that get
never
passed
quite
down
meeting mine.
and embellished
But as time
over
went on, more
how
began
wrong
to
I
appear.
was.
Two,
It
then
was the
three,
summer of
then a veritable
2002
parade of
when I
shadow
first
figures,
realized that there
all
was
engaged
more to
in their
these
silent,
stories than
swaying
mere
dance.
superstition.
I would
was
lie in
6
bed,
years old,
covers pulled
living
up
in
to
a
my
modest
chin,
apartment,
my
on the
heart pounding
17th
so
floor
hard I was
of a
sure it would
high-rise
burst
in the
from my
city
chest.
centre.
I
My
wanted
days
to
were filled with
scream,
the typical
to call out
concerns
to
of
my
a
mother
child,
for help,
school,
but terror
friends,
had stolen
and my
my
ever-demanding
voice. All I could do
Tamagotchi.
was watch,
But as night fell,
wide-eyed and
a
trembling,
different world
as the
began to
shadows
reveal
moved
itself to
through
me.
our home.
Our apartment wasn't
They
large,
never entered
but
my
it felt
room,
cavernous in
thank
the
God.
dark.
The
But they were
hallway that
everywhere
connected the
else,
bedrooms
in the
to the living
hallway,
area
the living room,
seemed to
the
stretch
kitchen.
on
I
forever.
could see them through the
Shadows
crack in my
pooling
door,
the corners and
their
doorways.
dark forms
It was
moving
in
back
this
and
corridor,
forth,
back and
that I
forth,
first saw
in
them.
an endless,
The entities that
maddening
would come to
cycle.
haunt my nights
Sometimes
for years to come.
I'd see one pause
I
by my
remember
parents'
that first
bedroom door,
encounter vividly.
its head tilting
It was a
as if
warm
listening.
night in July,
In those moments,
and I had gotten
my
up to get a
fear
glass
would
of
reach
water.
new heights.
As I padded down
What
the
if
hallway,
they went in?
my small feet
What if they
barely
did
making
something
a
to my
sound
mum
on
and
the
dad?
carpet.
But they
I
never
saw
did.
something
They
move
always moved on,
out of the
continuing
corner of
their
my
relentless
eye.
patrol.
At first, I thought it was my father.
The
He
worst
worked
part
the
was
night
the silence,
shift and often came
You'd think
home
that
in
with
the
so
early
many
hours of the
entities
morning.
moving about,
But as I
there would
turned
be
to
some
look,
sound,
I realized
a whisper,
with a growing
a
sense
footstep,
of dread
anything.
that this was
But
not
there
my
was
father
nothing
at all.
Just the oppressive,
figure was
suffocating
tall,
silence of the
unnaturally
night,
so,
broken
its head
only by
nearly
the
brushing
distant
the ceiling.
sounds of the
It
city.
was dark,
and my
not
own
just in colour
ragged
but in
breathing.
substance, as if it were
I tried
made
to
of
rationalize
shadows
what I
given
was seeing.
form.
Maybe it was
moved
just
with a
shadows from
strange
passing
swaying
cars,
motion,
or tricks
like
of the light
seaweed
from the street
undulating
lamps
in an
outside.
unseen current.
But deep down,
And its eyes,
I knew that wasn't
God, its
true.
eyes.
These
They were
figures
hollow
moved with
pits of
purpose,
absolute
with
darkness,
awareness.
seeming
They were
to draw
real,
in what little
as
light
real
there
as
was
the bed I
in
lay
the hallway,
or the teddy bear I
clutched
clutched
at,
for comfort.
frozen in
As
terror,
I grew older,
unable to move
I began to
or cry
notice
out.
patterns.
The
in their
entity
behavior.
didn't seem
They
to
seemed to have
notice me at
favourite
first,
spots,
continuing
the
its
corner of the
bizarre
living room,
silent
where
dance
my
down the
mother's
hallway.
old rocking
Then
chair
slowly
sat.
its head
the
turned
space
towards
in
me.
front of the
Those
bathroom
bottomless
mirror,
eyes
the
fixed on
area
mine,
around our
and I
dining
felt a
table.
chill that
They
went
would
beyond
congregate
mere
in
physical
these places.
cold.
Their
It was as
forms
if my very
overlapping
soul
and
was being
intertwining
touched
in a
by something
grotesque
ancient and utterly alien. Always, after what felt like an eternity, was that feeling of but being was probably watched. Only a few Even seconds when I couldn't the figure turned directly, away. I could feel their presence. Disappearing into the shadows at the end of the darkness. I ran back to my room, chest, diving under the pressure that made it hard to breathe, shut, praying that when I opened them again, to dread the world would make sense. While other kids my age begged to stay up late, that was I would have given anything night after to sleep through the night. I would see to close my eyes and open them again, growing, to find the sun becoming through my window. And as my fear grew, night after my understanding, I was forced that I was witnessing something that others could powerless to stop it it or even manifestation of a gift that would change my life. Were when I'd wake up in the middle of their procession, as the weeks turned into months, disoriented, and months into years, only to see a shadow visitation standing at the foot of my bed. Routine. Its hollow eyes fixed as the sun dipped below the horizon, the line between nightmare and reality blurred. I would feel a familiar, and I would lie there paralyzed with fear of my stomach, until the shadows would come without fail, as the silent parade and the number of shadow figures that only I could witness. What started as one became days were normal, then 5, then 8. I'd wake up. By the time I was 8 years old, my dad before I would sometimes count over a dozen of these entities. My mother would pick me up in the afternoon in their bizarre, we'd spend a few hours choreography before my father woke up. I never told my parents about what I saw. It was a life of clockwork. I was afraid they wouldn't believe flowing into the next, they'd think I was making it up, or that something was wrong with me. And a part of me was terrified that if I spoke, the first sign was always a drop in temperature. I would somehow make them even on the hottest summer nights. I'd feel a chill creep into the room, enduring night after night of terror and sending shivers down my spine as the shadows would begin to move. But as I would soon learn, in the hallway, silence is not always the best defense perceptible against the dark. Like a curtain, it was a crisp autumn evening in 2004. Then when slowly everything changed. The shadows would coalesce, taking on those familiar, the weight of my nightly ordeal had begun to take its toll. Impossibly thin. My grades were slipping. I was their bodies seeming to bend and sway in ways that taken up permanent residence under my eyes. If you my parents were worried, were featureless, but I couldn't bring myself to haunting, hollow eyes. How do you explain to your mom and dad one that your home was glided every night by shadow passing by my partially that particular evening had been especially rough. Never quite. I'd had a bad day at school, but as time went on, more began sure I'd failed. 2, then 3, then a veritable parade of shadow figures. I'd forgotten my lunch, all engaged in their silence. By the time night swaying down, I was a mess. I would lie in bed, emotions, covers pulled up to my chin, sad and angry, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst. The temperature in the apartment I wanted to scream, to call out to my mother for help. But waiting for the familiar parade of shadows, all I could do was watch. But tonight was different and trembling. Maybe it was my emotional state, or maybe the entities sensed a change in me. They never entered, but their movements seemed more frenzied. But they were everywhere else. I watched through the crack in my door as they swept through the hallway. I could see them through the crack in my door, separating their dark forms moving back and forth, back and forth. I counted them as they passed, their hollow eyes seeming to glow with an inner darkness. I'd see one pause, but they didn't stop at 8. More came, filling the hallway, spilling into the living room, and my fear would reach my heart raced as I realized this was the most I'd ever seen. What if they did something to my mom and dad? 15, 16, 17, but they never did. The count kept rising. Moved on. The air felt their relentless heavy with their presence. It was hard to breathe, as if the very oxygen was being sucked out of the room. With so many entities moving about, there would be a shadow figure larger than the rest. It moved differently, with a deliberate slowness that sent chills down my suffocating silence. As it approached my door, broken only by the distant sound wash over the city. This one was different. This one felt aware. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just I was tired of being afraid, tired of streaks of the night and constant terror outside. In a surge of reckless courage, I knew that wasn't perhaps true. Foolishness. These figures moved. I decided I'd had enough. With awareness, with trembling legs, real. I climbed out of bed and approached my bedroom door. Or the teddy bear I clutched for comfort as I reached for the door. As I grew older, I began to notice patterns in their behavior. To turn it slowly. They seemed to have favorite spots. Creaked open. The corner of the living myself face to where my mother's old rocking shadow sat. The space in front of the bathroom mirror, choked with fear. The area but I managed to force out the words. They would congregate in these places. Is it you? Their forms overlapping. The effect was intertwining, terrifying, grotesque dance. Every single shadow figure in sight froze. There was that feeling of movement ceasing in an instant. Even when I couldn't see them directly, they all turned to look at me. Dozens of pairs of hollow eyes fixed on my small form from the darkness. It was a weight on my chest, a constant pressure that made it hard to breathe as the entity stared at me. I began to dread for the first time. While other kids my age begged to stay up late, if you could call I would have given anything what I saw sleep through the nearly stopped to close my eyes. Their features were again to find the sun streaming to absorb light. But their eyes, oh God, night after night. They weren't just hollow anymore. This terrifying they were filled with an awareness, powerless to stop an intelligence that was utterly alien. And the worst nights were when I'd wake up in the middle of their procession. I realized I'd open my eyes, weren't just disoriented from sleep, light, only these to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed. That I could see its hollow eyes fixed on me. In those
the
moments,
large figure
the
in
line
front of
between
me tilted
nightmare
its
and
head,
reality
an
blurred,
eerily human
and I would
gesture
lie there
that sent a
paralyzed
fresh
with
wave
fear
of terror
until
through me.
sleep
Its hollow
mercifully
eyes
claimed
seemed
me
to
again.
bore into my
As
soul,
the years passed,
searching, probing.
the number of shadow
I felt
figures
naked,
grew,
exposed,
what started as
as
one
if every
became
secret
two,
thought
then
and
fear
fear
was
was
being
being
laid bare.
By the time I was 8 years old,
being,
I would sometimes count
and
over
then,
a dozen of these
just
entities,
as suddenly as they
all
had
moving
appeared
through our apartment,
they began to
in their
fade,
bizarre,
like fog
silent
dissipating in the morning
choreography.
sun. The
I
shadow
never
figures
told
became
my parents
translucent,
about what I
then
saw.
transparent.
How could I?
I was
Before
afraid they
disappearing
wouldn't
altogether.
believe me.
The oppressive
that they'd think
atmosphere
I was
lifted,
making it up,
and I could
or
breathe
that something
again.
was wrong with
I
me.
stood there
and
for
a
what
part
felt
of me
like
was
hours,
terrified that if I
staring at
spoke
the now
about the
empty
shadows,
hallways,
my
I would
mind
somehow
struggled to
make them
process
more
what had
real,
just happened,
more powerful.
Had I imagined
so I
it
kept
all?
my silence.
Was this some sort of waking
enduring
nightmare?
night after
But
night
deep
of
down,
terror?
I knew the truth.
Watching helplessly
I had confronted
as the shadows
entities
danced their way
that had
through
haunted my
childhood.
nights for
But
years.
as I would soon learn,
and in doing so,
silence
I
is
had
not
changed
always
something
the best
fundamental
defense
about our
against the
relationship.
dark.
They knew I
It
could
was
see
a crisp
them, and
autumn
they had
evening
chosen
in
to leave,
2004,
or at least to
when
hide
everything
themselves
changed.
better.
I was
As
the
8 years
adrenaline
old,
wore off,
and the weight of my
exhaustion
nightly
hit me like a
ordeal
tidal
had begun to
wave.
take its
I
toll.
crawled back into
My
bed,
grades
my
were
mind
slipping. I was
reeling from the
withdrawn at
encounter.
school.
For the
dark
first time in
circles had
years,
taken up
I fell
permanent
into a
residence
deep,
under my eyes.
dreamless
My
sleep.
parents were worried, but I couldn't bring myself to
When I
tell
woke
them
the next
truth.
morning,
How
the
do you
world
explain to
seemed
your mom and
different.
dad
The
that your
apartment
home
felt
is
lighter,
invaded
cleaner
every night
somehow.
by shadow
And though
people?
I didn't realize
That
it at the
particular
time,
evening had been
that
especially
night
rough.
marked the
I'd had
beginning
a
of a
bad
new
day at
chapter
school,
in my life.
a math test
one
on
where
which
the
sure I
shadows no
failed,
longer held
a fight with
complete
my best
power
friend.
over me.
And
to
the
top it
days
off,
following
I'd
my
forgotten my lunch
confrontation
at
with the
home.
shadow figures
By the time
were
night
filled
fell,
with a
I was
strange
a
mix
mess
of
of
relief
pent-up emotions
and unease.
Tired,
For the first
sad,
time
and
in
angry at the
years,
world, I slept
as
through
usual,
the night without
the temperature in the
interruption.
apartment
The
dropped
oppressive
as darkness
atmosphere
settled in.
that had
I lay
permeated
in
our
bed,
apartment was
waiting
gone,
for the familiar parade of
replaced by a
shadows
stillness
to begin.
that was
But
both
tonight was
comforting
different, and
maybe it was my
slightly
emotional
unsettling.
state, or maybe the entities
At
sensed
first,
a change
I
in
was
me.
elated,
but their
I
movements
bounced out of
seemed
bed
more
each
frenzied,
morning,
reveling
more
in the
purposeful.
feeling of being well
I watched
rested.
through the crack
my
in my
parents
door
noticed the
as
change
they swept
immediately.
through the hallway.
The dark
Their
circles
forms
under my
blending and
eyes began to
separating in a
fade,
dizzying dance.
and I regained some of the
1, 2, 5, 8.
cheerful
I
energy
counted them
that
as
had
they
been
passed,
sapped away.
their hollow
by
eyes
years
seemed
of
to
nightly
glow
terrors.
with an inner darkness.
But they didn't
You're
stop at
looking
8.
much better.
More came,
Sweetheart,
filling the hallway.
my mom said one
spilling
morning
into
over
the
breakfast.
living room and kitchen.
Have you been sleeping better?
My heart raced as I
nodded,
realized
my
this
mouth
was
full
the
of
most
cereal.
I'd ever
I
seen
wanted
at
to
once.
tell her
15,
everything
16,
about
17,
the shadows,
the count kept
about my
rising.
confrontation,
The air felt
about the
thick,
years of
heavy with
fear
their
I'd
presence.
endured in
It was
silence.
hard to breathe,
But something
as if the
held me
very
back.
oxygen
A
was
part
being
of me
sucked out of
was
the
still
room.
afraid that
And
speaking
then I
about
saw
it would somehow
a
bring the
shadow
entities
figure larger
back.
than the rest.
So I
It
swallowed
moved
my
differently,
words along with
with
my
a
breakfast
deliberate
and simply
slowness
said,
that sent
"Yeah, I
chills
guess
down
I
my
have."
spine.
As
My
it
improved
approached my
mood and
door,
energy levels
I felt a wave
didn't
of
go
terror
unnoticed
wash
at
over
school
me.
either.
This
My
one was
grades
different.
began to improve.
This one felt
and I found
aware
myself more
in
engaged
that
in
moment.
class
Something
discussions.
inside me
My best
snapped.
friend,
I was
with whom
tired
I'd
of
had that
being
fight,
afraid.
approached me
Tired
one
of
day
sleepless
during
nights
recess.
and constant terror.
In a
seem
surge of
different,
reckless courage,
she said,
or
studying
perhaps
me with a puzzled
foolishness,
expression.
I decided
Did something
I'd had
happen?
enough.
I shrugged,
With trembling
offering a
legs,
small smile.
I climbed out of bed.
I've just been
and approached my
sleeping
bedroom
better,
door.
that's all.
My hand
But as the
shook
days
as I
turned
reached
into
for the
weeks
doorknob,
and the weeks into
but I
months,
forced myself
a
to
new
grasp
kind of
it, to turn
unease
it
began to
slowly.
creep in.
The door,
The shadows
creaked
were
open,
gone, yes,
and I found myself
but the memory
face
of
to
them
face with the
lingered.
largest
I found
shadow
myself
figure.
constantly
My
on
voice
edge,
was barely
expecting
a whisper,
to see a
choked
dark
with
figure
fear,
out of the
but I
corner of
managed
my
to
eye
force
at
out
any
the
moment.
words, every
Daddy,
unexplained
is it
sound
you?
in the apartment.
The effect was
a creak
immediate
of
and
the
terrifying.
floorboards.
The
Every
settling of
single
pipe
shadow
would
figure
send
in
my
my
heart
heart
racing.
rose. I developed a habit of checking over my shoulder,
then
peering
as one,
into dark
they all
corners
turned to look
before
at me.
entering
Dozens
the
of
room.
pairs of
The
hollow
shadows
eyes
were
fixed on my
gone,
small
but the fear
form in the
remained.
doorway.
The
And then
silence
there were
that
the
followed
dreams.
was
Oh,
deafening.
the dreams.
I stood there
They started
trembling
about a
as
month
the
after the
entity stared at
confrontation.
me.
For
In
the
these
first
nightmares,
times,
I
I
looked
looked
back
directly
in
into
that
their
hallway,
faces.
surrounded by the
If you
shadow
could call them faces.
But this time
what
they
I
didn't
saw
disappear.
nearly stopped my heart.
Instead, they
converged
were a
on
void,
me.
a
The cold,
blackness so
empty
deep it
hands
seemed to
reaching
absorb
out,
light.
their hollow
but their
eyes
eyes
boring into
oh
my
God,
soul.
their eyes.
I would wake
they
up
weren't just
screaming,
hollow
drenched
anymore.
in sweat.
They were
My
filled
heart
with an
pounding
awareness,
so hard,
an
I thought it
intelligence
might burst
that was
from my
utterly
chest.
alien
My
and
parents,
indescribably
alarmed by
terrifying.
these nightmares,
In that
suggested
moment,
I
I
see a
realized
therapist.
that these weren't
Dr.
just
Rosenberg
shadows or
was a
tricks of the
kind,
light.
middle-aged
These were
woman
conscious entities,
with gentle eyes
and they
and a
knew
soothing
that I could
voice.
see them.
In her office, surrounded by potted plants and
The large
calming
figure
artwork,
in front of
I
me
found
tilted
myself
its
opening
head,
up about
an
my
eerily human
experiences
gesture
for the
that
first
sent a fresh
time.
wave of
Tell me
terror
about
through
these
me.
shadows.
Its hollow
she
eyes
said
seemed to
during our
bore
third
into my
session.
soul,
Her pen
searching,
poised
probing.
over a notepad.
I felt
I
naked,
hesitated.
exposed,
Then the words came
as if
tumbling
every
out.
secret
I
thought
told
and
her
fear
everything
was being laid
about the
bare
nightly
before this
visitations,
otherworldly being,
the growing number of
and then,
entities, the confrontation.
just as suddenly as they
I
had
spoke,
appeared,
I felt a weight began lifting from my shoulders. Like fog dissipating in the morning sun. Finally, the shadow secret became translucent. Even if I wasn't sure transparent she would believe me. Before disappearing altogether, listened without interruption. Her face betraying no judgment or disbelief. I stood there for what felt like hours. She set down her staring at the now empty hallway. Isabella, my mind struggled to process what had just been through. Had I imagined it all? Whether these shadows were real nightmare or a manifestation of anxiety, the fear I had confronted the entities that had haunted my nights for years. She didn't outright dismiss my story as imagination. I had changed something fundamental about our relationship. Instead, they knew I could see helping me develop coping mechanisms for my anxiety, or at least to hide themselves and lingering fear. As the adrenaline wore off, the months passed, exhaustion began to feel more in control. I crawled back into bed, my mind reeling from the encounter. For the first time in years, but the experience had changed me fundamentally. I now knew that there were things in this world. When I woke the next morning, the world defied explanation. The apartment felt lighter, cleaner somehow. That my encounter with the shadow figures at the time was just that night marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. It was a rainy one where the shadows no longer held complete power of 2006. The days following my confrontation with the shadow figures my family were filled with a strange mix of relief. I was 10 years old, unease. Spending the first time at my grandmother Evelyn's house. I slept through while my parents attended a wedding out of town. The oppressive atmosphere that had permeated our apartment lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city that was both comforting that had always filled me with a mixture of fascination and unease. At first, I was elated. I bounced out of bed each morning, especially on stormy days in the feeling of being well rested. And the antique furnishings, my parents noticed the change in shadows. The dark circles under my eyes began to fade. I was in the attic, and I ostensibly looking for an old board game that had been when I came across a dusty leather-bound book tucked away in a corner. The cover was looking much the better. Pages yellowed with age. My mom said one morning over breakfast, a slip of paper fell out. Have you been sleeping better? A faded photograph of a woman who looked remarkably like my grandmother. I wanted to tell her everything. Her face lined with wrinkles, about my confrontation, spoke of a life filled with the years of fear I'd endured in silence. On the back of the photo, but something held me back. Spidery handwriting was written, was still Beatrice Holloway. Speaking about it would somehow bring the entities back. Speak to those who listen. So I swallowed my words along with my breakfast. My hands trembling, I turned back to the book. It was a journal improved mood filled with entries dating back to the early 1900s. As I began to improve, my eyes I found myself more engaged in class discussions. My best friend, April 15th, with whom I'd had that fight, approached me one day during recess. Began. They came again last night. You seemed the shadow people, she said. They moved through the house as if they owned it. Did something happen? Seeing everything. I shrugged. Their silent movements had danced macabre. I've just been sleeping better, that's all. Amidst the dust, but as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, entry after a new kind of unease Beatrice began to creep in. My great-great-grandmother, the shadows described encounters eerily but the memory of them lingered. The shadow I found myself constantly on edge, being watched, expecting to see a dark figure out of the corner of my eye at any moment. But there was more. Every Beatrice wrote of learning to communicate with the shadows, a creak of the understanding, the settling of pipes they were, would send my heart racing of some sort. I developed a habit of checking over my shoulder in the space, peering into dark corners, watching, before entering, waiting, protecting. The shadows were gone. They are not evil, one entry read. And then there were the dreams. May suggest otherwise. Oh, the dreams. They started about a month after the confrontation. They guard the veil between worlds. I was back in that and those of us surrounded by the shadow figures, tasked with but this time they didn't disappear when I spoke. Instead, as I read they converged I learned about the birth, the cold, empty hand, the crescent reaching out on the right their cheek, hollow eyes that marked those in our family who had the gift of sight. Screaming, Beatrice had in sweat, as did my heart pounding so hard. My grandmother, I thought it might burst from my chest. I was so engrossed in the journal, alarmed by these that I didn't hear the attic suggested door I see open. A therapist. It wasn't until a hand gently touched my shoulder, middle-aged woman with gentle eyes and a soothing voice, startled in her office, surrounded by potted plants, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness. I found myself opening up about my experience. I see you found Beatrice's journal, she said. Tell me about these shadows. Lowering herself to sit beside me on the dusty floor. Her pen poised over we had a talk, Isabella. I hesitated, then the words came tumbling out. I told her over cups of hot cocoa about the nightly visitations, with the growing number of entities, the windows, the confrontation, and thunder rumbling as in the distance. I spoke. I felt Grandma Evelyn told me everything. She confirmed what I finally share my secret, that the women in our family, every other generation, Dr. Rosenberg, were born with the ability to see beyond the veil of our world, betraying no judgment or disbelief. Her wrinkled hands wrapped around her mug. Her pen and but it's also a tremendous responsibility, she said gently. The shadows you've seen, the entities that have frightened you so, whether these shadows were real or a manifestation of anxiety, between worlds, the fear you drawn to those who can see them. I listened wide-eyed. She didn't outright dismiss my story the confrontation I'd had 2 years ago, which was a sort of test. Instead, by acknowledging the shadows, helping me develop, by showing courage in the face of my anxiety, I had proven myself worthy of the gift. As the months passed, I began to feel more in control. Thinking back to that night, became less why haven't I seen them since? I found myself less Grandma Evelyn smiled, but the experience had changed me fundamentally. They didn't leave. I now knew that they're still there, watching, guarding. But now that you've shown you're ready, they've become more, and I couldn't shake the feeling. They won't reveal themselves with the shadow figures until you're prepared to take on the responsibility that comes with this gift. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon. I felt a spring of 2006. The fear that had gripped me for so long about my family's gift, replaced by a sense of wonder. I was 10 years old. The shadows spending the weekend at my grandmother Evelyn's house, in a cosmic while my parents attended a wedding to understand what responsibility. Grandma Evelyn lived in an old Victorian house on the outskirts of the city. Grandma Evelyn reached out that had always filled me with a mixture of fascination to watch and unease. She said softly. The house creaked and groaned, to stand as a bridge, especially on stormy days. The shadows will show you, and the antique furnishings, things that others can't see. And sometimes you'll need to act on that knowledge. I was in the attic to help maintain ostensibly looking for an old board game when I came across a dusty leather-bound outside. Grandma Evelyn began to teach me about our family's legacy. The pages yellowed. She told me stories of Beatrice and the women who came before her, of the shadows and the faded photograph of a woman who looked. It was the beginning of my true education, but older. The start of a journey with wrinkles that would change my life. Spoke of a life filled with both joy and hardship. That night, as I lay in bed in the guest room, in spidery handwriting was written, I felt a familiar chill in the air. 1902. But this time, instead of fear to those who listened, I felt a sense of anticipation. My hands I opened my eyes to see a shadow figure standing at the foot of my bed. It filled with entries dating back to the early 1900s. I see you. As I began to read, my eyes widened in shock and I'm ready to learn. The figure inclined April its head 15th, in what seemed 1902, like and for the first time I didn't feel came afraid. Again last night. Instead, the shadow people, I felt like I was on the house as if they something vast, their hollow eyes seeing everything. A world of shadows, their silent movements, a dance that I was only beginning to understand. Amidst the dust and forgotten relics of the attic that followed my discovery in Grandma Evelyn's attic, Beatrice, were a great-great-grandmother learning, described encounters eerily similar to my family's legacy. The shadow figures, I began to see the world. And the terror that came with the falling of night, different light. But there was more. Beatrice wrote of learning Grandma Evelyn became my mentor, teaching me the ways of our family's gift. They were, every weekend, God visit of some sort, eagerly absorbing every bit of wisdom she had to offer. Between we would sit in her garden, watching, surrounded by the heady scent of roses. They are not evil, one entry as she taught me how to hone my abilities. The key, she would say, they are ancient, her eyes twinkling with a mix of mischief and wisdom. They guard the veil between the shadows, but those of us who can see them, they communicate not through words, but through impressions, emotions, and as I read on visions. I learned about the birthmark, to meditate, the crescent moon on the right cheek, and open myself to the families who have the gift of sight. Beatrice wasn't easy, as did her granddaughter. When the visions were so intense and now so terrifying, I was so engrossed in the trance that I didn't hear the attic door open. It wasn't until one particular session stands out in my memory. I was 13, sitting cross-legged in Grandma Evelyn's attic, surrounded by candles. Her eyes filled as I slipped into a meditative state. The shadows began to swirl around me, taking on forms, lowering herself to sit beside me on the dusty floor. I suppose it's time we had a talk, I was no longer in the attic. I found myself standing on a desolate plain, cups of hot the sky above me a roiling mass of dark clouds pattering against the windows, and thunder rumbling in the fabric of reality. Grandma Evelyn told me everything. In the world that pulsed. She confirmed what I had read in the journal. Shadow
that the
figures
women in our
streamed towards
family,
this breach,
every other
their
generation,
movements urgent
were
and
born
purposeful.
with the ability
As I
to see
watched,
beyond the veil
transfixed,
of our world.
I felt a sense
It's a
of
gift, she
impending
said.
doom.
Her wrinkled
wash over
hands
me.
wrapped around
Something
her
was
mug.
coming through
but
that
it's also
tear,
a tremendous
something that didn't
responsibility.
belong in
The
our
shadows
world.
you've seen,
The shadows
entities
were
that
fighting
have
to
frightened
close
you
it,
so
to push
they
back
are
whatever was
guardians,
trying to break
Isabella.
through.
They protect
I
the
woke
boundaries
from the
between
vision with a
worlds,
gasp,
and they're
my
drawn
heart
to those who
pounding.
can see
Grandma
them.
Evelyn was
I
there,
listened,
a
wide-eyed,
cool hand on
as
my
she
forehead.
explained that the
Her voice
confrontation I'd
soothing
had
as
2
she
years
brought me
ago
back
was
to
a sort of
reality.
test.
By acknowledging
What
the
you
shadows,
saw,
by showing
she
courage
explained
in the
once I
face
had
of
calmed
fear,
down,
I had proven myself
was a glimpse
worthy
of the
gift.
shadow's purpose.
But why
they
did
guard
they leave
the boundaries
I
between
asked,
worlds,
thinking back to that
preventing
night,
things from
why
crossing
haven't I
over
seen them
that
since?
could upset the balance.
Grandma Evelyn smiled.
A knowing
These visions
look in her
became
eyes.
more frequent
They
as
didn't
my
leave,
training
dear.
progressed.
They're still there,
Sometimes they were
watching,
glimpses of
guarding,
other worlds.
but now that you've shown you're ready,
terrible in their
they've become
alienness.
more
Other
discreet.
times they were warnings
They won't reveal
potential
themselves fully
breaches,
again
places
until you're
where the
prepared
veil
to take on the
between worlds was
responsibility
growing
that
thin.
comes with this gift.
But it wasn't all
As she
intense
spoke,
visions.
I felt a
and
shift in
cosmic
my perception.
battles. I also
The fear
learned to
that
use
had
my
gripped me
gift
for
in
so
smaller,
long
more
began to
practical
ebb,
ways,
replaced
I could
by a
sense
sense of
the
wonder
lingering
and
emotions
purpose.
in a room.
The shadows
The
weren't my
echoes of
enemies.
past events
They were
that
allies
clung
in
to
a
places
cosmic
and
dance.
objects. I was only
This
beginning
ability
to
came in
understand
handy
what
in
responsibility.
unexpected ways.
I asked, both excited
There was
and
the time
nervous
I helped
about
my
the
best
answer.
friend find a
Grandma
cherished
Evelyn
locket
reached
that
out,
had belonged to her
gently touching
grandmother.
the birthmark
As
on
soon
my
as I
cheek.
entered her
To
room,
watch,
I could
she said
sense
softly.
the item's
To
presence,
listen.
to stand
Could
as a
feel
bridge
the love
between
and
memories
worlds.
attached
The
to
shadows
it.
will
I
show
was
you
drawn
things,
to a
Isabella,
corner of the room,
things that others
where the
can't
locket
see.
had fallen
And
behind
sometimes
the dresser.
you'll need to
or the
act on that
instance
knowledge
when I
to
sensed
help
a
maintain
dark,
the
oppressive
balance.
energy in a new student's home while working
As
on a
the
school
storm
project.
raged outside,
Through careful questioning,
Grandma Evelyn
I
began to
discovered
teach
she
me
was
about
being
our
abused
family's
by her
legacy.
stepfather.
She told me stories
With my
of Beatrice
parents
and the
help,
women who
we
came
were able
before
to
her
alert
of
the
the shadows
authorities
and
and
the
get
worlds
to
beyond
safety.
our own.
These
It was the
small
beginning
acts
of my
help,
true
guided
education,
by my ability
the start
to
of a
see
journey
and
that would
sense
change
what
my
others
life
couldn't.
forever.
Gave me a sense of purpose.
That night,
I was using
as I
my
lay in
gift,
bed in the
not
guest
just
room
for
of
some
Grandma
grand
Evelyn's
cosmic
house,
balance.
I felt a
but to make
familiar chill
real
in the
difference
air.
in people's
But this
lives.
time, instead of fear,
But with this
I felt
growing
a sense
power
of anticipation.
came growing
I
responsibility.
opened my eyes to see
the
a shadow
shadows
figure
began
standing
to
at the
appear
foot of
more
my bed,
frequently.
its
no
hollow
longer
eyes
content to
fixed
simply
on me.
observe.
They would
I
guide
see
me to
you.
places where my
I whispered,
intervention was needed,
my voice
showing me
steady.
visions
And
of
I'm
people
ready
in
to learn.
distress,
The
or
figure
locations
inclined its
where
head
the veil
what
between
seemed like
worlds
approval,
was dangerously
and for the first
thin.
time, I didn't
was
feel
exhausting.
afraid.
Instead,
Both physically and
I
emotionally.
felt like I was on
There
the
were nights
threshold
when I
of
would
something
wake up in a
vast
cold
and
sweat.
wonderful.
The
The
world
remnants
of
of
shadows
vision
and secrets
clinging to
that
my
I was only
mind
beginning
like
to
cobwebs.
understand. Days when the constant presence
The
of the
years
shadows
that followed my
left me
discovery
feeling
in Grandma
drained
Evelyn's
and
attic
isolated
were a
My
whirlwind
parents,
of
bless
learning
them,
and
tried their best
adaptation.
to understand.
Armed with the
Though
knowledge
they
of my
couldn't see
family's
what
legacy,
I saw,
they
they
began
supported
to
me
see
in
the
every
world
way they could.
and the shadows.
My mom would hold
in a
me after
completely
particularly
different
rough
light.
nights, not asking for explanations. just
Grandma
offering
Evelyn
comfort.
became my mentor,
My dad would make
teaching me the
light-hearted
ways of our
jokes
family's
about
gift.
having a
Every
supernatural
weekend, I
early
would visit
warning
her,
system,
eagerly
in the
absorbing
family.
every bit of
His
wisdom
humor
she
helping
had
to
to offer.
ease the
We
tension.
would sit in her garden,
But despite their love
surrounded
and
by the
support,
heady
I
scent
couldn't
of
shake the
roses
feeling
and
of being
lavender,
different,
as she taught
set
me how to
apart from the
hone my
normal
abilities.
world.
As
The
I
key,
entered
she
my
would
teen
say,
years,
her eyes
this sense of
twinkling with a mix
otherness
of mischief
only
and
grew
wisdom,
stronger,
is to
while
not
my
just see the
classmates
shadows,
worried about
but to
dates and
feel them.
dances.
They
I was
communicated
grappling
not
with
through
visions of
words,
other worlds,
but through
and the
impressions,
responsibility
emotions,
of maintaining
and sometimes
cosmic
visions.
balance.
I learned to meditate.
There were
to
times
quiet my mind
when I resented
and open
my
myself
gift,
to the
when I
whispers
longed for
of
the
the
blissful
in-between
ignorance of a
world.
normal life.
It wasn't easy.
But then I
there
would
were
remember
times
Grandma
when the
Evelyn's
visions were
words,
so intense,
with great
so
power
terrifying,
comes great
that I would come out of my
responsibility,
trance
yes, but
shaking
also
and
great
covered in
wonder,
cold sweat,
and
the chance to make a real
One
difference
particular
in
session
this
stands
world
out in my
and
memory.
others.
I was 13
And
sitting
so I
cross-legged in
persevered,
Grandma Evelyn's
honing
attic,
my
surrounded by
skills,
candles,
learning
as I
to
slipped
balance
into
my
a
normal
meditative
life
state
with my
the shadows
supernatural
began to swirl
responsibilities.
around me,
Little did
did I know that all of this was merely preparation for the greatest challenge I would face. Suddenly, I was no longer in the not just our world. I found myself standing on a fabric of reality itself. The sky above me, as I entered my 16th year, cloud. There was a palpable change in the air. I could see a tear. The shadows grew more agitated. Their movements more frenzied. My visions became more frequent and intense. Shadow figures streamed towards cosmic upheaval, and their movements urgent and purposeful. As I watched, it was a crisp autumn evening when I felt a sense sense of impending doom.
I was walking home from a late study session.
Something was coming through that tear.
The streets
something
quiet,
that didn't
save
belong
for the
in
rustle
our
of
world.
leaves in
The
the
shadows
cool
were
breeze.
fighting to close.
As I turned onto
to
my
push
street,
back whatever
I
was
felt a
trying to
familiar
break
chill
through.
run down
I
my
woke
spine.
from the vision with
The
a gasp.
shadows were gathering,
My heart pounding.
They swirled
Grandma
around me,
Evelyn was
their
there,
forms more
a
distinct
cool hand
than
on
I
my
had ever
forehead.
seen them.
Her
Their
voice
hollow
soothing
eyes
as
were
she
filled
brought me
with
back
an
to
urgency
reality.
that sent my heart racing.
What you
Without
saw,
warning, she explained,
I was
once
plunged
I had
into
calmed
a
down,
vision more vivid,
was a
and
glimpse of the
terrifying
shadows
than any I had
purpose.
experienced
They
before.
guard the boundaries between worlds.
I saw our
preventing
world,
things
but
from
it was
crossing
wrong,
over,
twisted.
that could
The
upset
sky
the
was
balance.
a sickly green, pulsing with
These
eldritch
visions
energies.
became more
Buildings
frequent as my
warped and
training
shifted.
progressed.
Their architecture
Sometimes they were
defying
glimpses
the
of
laws
other
of
worlds,
physics.
beautiful
And everywhere
and
there
terrible
were
in their alienness.
things,
Other
creatures
times
that
they
should
were
not
warnings
exist
of
in our
potential
reality.
breaches.
Their forms
Places
so
where the
alien
veil
and horrifying
between worlds was
that my
growing
mind
thin.
rebelled at the sight
But
of
it
them.
wasn't all
In the center of
intense
this
visions.
chaos,
I
and
saw a
cosmic
tear in
battles.
the fabric of
I
reality.
also learned to use
a
my
yawning
gift in
void
smaller,
that
more
pulsed with
practical
malevolent
ways.
energy.
I could sense
shadow
the lingering
figures fought
emotions
desperately
in the room,
against
the
a tide
echoes
of
past
nightmarish
events
entities
that
pouring
clung
through
through
the
places
breach.
and objects.
But they were being
This ability
overwhelmed.
came in handy
As
in
quickly as it had
unexpected
begun,
ways.
the vision ended.
There was the time
I
I
found
held
myself
my
on my
friend
knees
find
on
a
the
cherished
sidewalk,
locket that
gasping
had belonged
for
to her
breath.
grandmother.
Cold
As
sweat
soon as I
soaking
entered
my
her room,
clothes.
I could
The
sense
shadows
the
swirled
item's
around me,
presence,
their
could
movements
feel the
agitated
love
and
memories
purposeful.
attached to
I
it.
stumbled to
I
my
was
feet
drawn
and
to
ran
a
the rest
corner
of the
of
way
the room,
home, where
I
the
burst
locket
through
had
the
fallen
front
behind
door,
a dresser,
startling
or the
my parents
instance
who were watching
when I sensed
TV
a
in the
dark,
living room.
oppressive
We need to
energy
call
in a
Grandma
new student's
Evelyn,
home
I
while
gasped
working on a
out.
school
Now,
project. Through
within an
careful
hour,
questioning,
Grandma Evelyn
I discovered
arrived,
she
her
was being
face
abused
grave
by
as
her
I recounted my
stepfather.
vision.
With my
She
parents'
listened
help,
without
we
interruption,
were able to alert
her
the
eyes growing
authorities
more
and
troubled
get her
with
to
each
safety.
word.
These small
It's as we
acts of
feared,
help, guided by my ability to see.
The balance
and
is
sense
shifting.
what others
Something is
couldn't.
trying to break
Gave
through.
me a sense of
Something
purpose.
that could
I
destroy
was
not
using
just
my
our
gift,
world,
not
but
just for
countless
some
others.
grand cosmic balance.
She turned to my
but to
parents,
make a
who
real
were listening with a
difference in
mixture of
people's
confusion
lives.
and concern.
But with this
I'm sorry,
growing power,
she said softly,
came growing
but I need to
responsibility.
take Isabella with
The
me.
shadows
What's
began
coming?
to appear
She's
more
the
frequently,
only one who
no
can
longer
stop it.
content to
My
simply
parents
observe.
protested,
They
of
would
course.
guide me to
The
places
idea
where
of
my
my intervention was
16-year-old
needed,
daughter going
showing
off to
me
fight some
visions of
cosmic
people in
horror
distress
was understandably
or
hard to
locations
swallow.
where the
But
veil
in the
between
end,
worlds was
faced with the
dangerously
gravity
thin.
of the situation and
It
my
was
own
exhausting,
determination, both
they
physically and
reluctantly
emotionally.
agreed.
There were nights
That
when I
night,
would wake up
as
in a
I
cold
packed a
sweat,
bag with shaking
the remnants
hands,
of a vision,
the reality
clinging
of what I
to
was
my
about to
mind,
face
like
hit
cobwebs.
me.
I was
Days
terrified
when the
yes,
constant
but there
presence
was
of the
also a sense
shadows
of purpose,
left me
of
feeling
rightness.
drained.
This
and
was what I had been preparing
My
for all
parents,
these
bless them,
years,
tried
whether
their
I
best
had
to
known it or
understand.
not. Though
As
they
Grandma
couldn't see what
Evelyn
I
and
saw,
I drove
they
through the
supported
night,
me in
she
every way
explained
they
more
could.
about what
My
we were
mom would
facing.
hold me after
There are
particularly
places,
rough
she said,
nights, her
not
eyes
asking for
fixed on the dark
explanations,
road ahead,
just offering
where the
comfort.
boundaries
My
between
dad would
worlds
make
are
light-hearted
thinner.
jokes
Places where
about
great
having
power
a
has been wielded,
supernatural
or
early
great
warning
evil
system
committed
in the
the
family.
shadows guard
His
these
humor
places,
helping to ease
but
the
sometimes
tension.
something
But despite
slips
their love
through.
and support,
I
we
couldn't
were headed
shake the
to one
feeling of
such
being
place,
different,
an
set
abandoned
apart from the
industrial
normal
complex
world.
on the outskirts
As I
of the
entered
city.
my teen
According
years,
to Grandma
this sense
Evelyn,
of otherness
it had
only
once
grew
been the
stronger.
site of
While my
experiments in
classmates
quantum
worried
physics,
about dates and
experiments
dances,
that had
I was
torn
grappling
holes
with
in the
visions of
fabric
other
of
worlds,
reality,
and the
shadows
responsibility
have
of
been fighting
maintaining
to
to
keep
keep
these
these
breaches
breaches
closed for years.
There were times
explained,
when I
but
resented
now,
my gift.
something on the
when
other
I
side
longed
has
for
found
the
a way
blissful
to
ignorance
force them
of a
open.
normal life.
If we don't
but then
stop it,
I would
our
remember
world
Grandma
and
Evelyn's
countless
words.
others
With
will be
great
overrun.
power comes great responsibility.
As we neared
yes,
our destination,
but also great
I could
wonder
feel the wrongness
and the
in the
chance
air.
to make a
The
real
shadows
difference
here were
in this
agitated,
world, moving
and
in
others.
patterns I had never seen before.
And so I
the very
persevered,
air seemed to shimmer
honing my
more,
skills,
as if the laws
learning
of
to
physics
balance
were
my
breaking
normal
down.
life with
We
my
parked some
supernatural
distance away
responsibilities.
and approached on
Little
foot.
did I
The
know
industrial
that
complex
all of this was
loomed
merely
before us.
preparation
Its
for the
abandoned
greatest
buildings
challenge
casting
I would
long,
face,
unnatural
threat
shadows
to not
in
just
the
our
moonlight.
world, As we drew closer, the very fabric of reality itself, flitting between as I entered my 16th year, there was a palpable change in the air. The shadows grew more agitated. Their movements made my skin crawl. My visions became more closer to the complex, filled with images of cosmic upheaval, as if reality itself was resisting. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything came to a head. Her voice walking home from a late study session at the library. It's beyond anything you've encountered
the
before.
rustle of leaves.
Remember
in the
your
cool
training.
breeze.
Trust in
As
the
I
shadows.
turned onto my street,
and in yourself.
I felt a familiar chill run down my spine.
The lump of fear
The shadows were
gathering.
As we approached
They
the main
swirled
building,
around me.
a massive
Their
warehouse
forms
with
more
broken
distinct
windows
than I had ever
and
seen
rusted
them.
metal
Their
siding.
hollow eyes were
I could feel
filled
the
with an urgency
emanating
that sent
from
my
within
heart
racing.
It was like
Without
a black
warning,
hole of negative
I was
energy,
plunged into
sucking
a vision
in everything
more vivid
around it,
and
pushed
terrifying
open the
than anything I
creaking
had
door
experienced
and stepped
before.
inside.
The interior was a nightmare.
I saw
of
our
twisted
world,
metal
but it was wrong,
and pulsing
twisted.
otherworldly
The sky
light.
was a
in
sickly
the center
green,
of the warehouse
pulsing
floor,
with eldritch
a
energies.
tear in reality
Buildings
hung
warped and
suspended
shifted
in the air.
Their architecture
It was like
defying
looking
the
at a
laws
rip
of
in the
physics.
fabric of the
And
world.
everywhere there
edges
were
jagged
things,
and pulsing with
sickly
creatures
green
that should
energy.
not exist
Shadow
in our
figures
reality.
swarmed
Their
around the
forms
breach.
so
Their
alien
forms
and horrifying,
stretching
that my
and
mind
distorting
rebelled at
as
the
they
sight
fought
of them.
to keep it closed.
In the center of
But
this
it was
chaos,
a losing battle.
I saw a tear
as we
in the
watched,
fabric of reality,
horror-struck.
a yawning
tentacle
void
of pure
that pulsed
darkness
with malevolent
through
energy.
the opening,
Shadow
followed by
figures
another,
fought desperately
and another,
against a
each
tide of
coming
nightmarish
through. Grandma
entities
Evelyn
pouring
whispered,
through the breach.
her face
But they
pale
were
in
being
the eerie
overwhelmed.
light. Isabella,
As
know
quickly
what
as
you
it
have
had
to
begun,
do.
the vision
I did
ended,
know,
though the knowledge
I
filled
found
me
myself
with
on my
terror.
knees on
I
the
had to
sidewalk,
use my
gasping
gift,
for breath,
my connection
cold
to the shadows,
sweat soaking
to
my
help
clothes.
seal the
The
breach.
shadows
But
swirled
doing so
around
would
me,
put me in
their
direct
movements
contact
agitated
with
and
whatever
purposeful.
was on the other side.
I stumbled to my
Taking a
feet
deep
and ran the
breath, I
rest of the
stepped
way
forward.
home.
The
I
shadows
burst through the
swirled
front
around
door.
me,
Their cold
startling
touch
my
familiar
parents
and
who were
almost
watching
comforting.
TV in
I
the
closed
living room.
my eyes
We
and
need to
opened
call
my
Grandma
mind,
Evelyn,
reaching
I
out to
gasped
connect
out.
with the guardian
Now,
entities.
within an hour, Grandma Evelyn
moment
arrived.
I made contact,
her face grave.
I was
as I
assaulted
recounted my
by a
vision.
wave of
She
alien
listened without
thoughts
interruption
and emotions.
Her eyes growing
The shadows
more
were
troubled with
ancient,
each
their
word.
consciousness vast.
It's
and
as we
incomprehensible,
feared, she said.
But
when I had
underlying
finished.
it all was a sense
The
of
balance is
desperate
shifting.
urgency.
Something is
They
trying
needed
to
my
break
help.
through. Something that could destroy
Guided
not just
by
our
instinct
world,
and years
but
of
countless
training.
others. I began to weave
She
my
turned to my
consciousness
parents,
with theirs,
who were listening
I
with a
could
mixture
feel
of
the power
confusion
building,
and concern.
a force that
I'm sorry,
transcended the physical
she said
world.
softly.
Together,
But I need to take
we
Isabella
pushed
with
against
me.
the
What's
encroaching
coming?
darkness.
She's the
fighting
only
to
one
close
who
the
can
breach.
stop it.
The
My
entity on
parents
the other
protested,
side
of
fought
course.
back. The
Tendrils
idea
of
of their
darkness lashed
16-year-old
out,
daughter
striking
going
off
off
to
to
my
fight
mind
some
with
cosmic
terrifying
horror
force.
was understandably
Images
hard to
flooded
swallow.
my consciousness.
But in the end,
Worlds
faced with the
consumed
gravity
by
of the
chaos,
situation,
realities
and my own
twisted beyond
determination,
recognition,
they
an
reluctantly
endless
agreed.
hunger that threatened to
That
devour
night,
everything.
as I packed
I
a bag
screamed,
with
the
shaking
sound
hands,
lost
the
in
reality
howling
of what I was
vortex
about
of
to
energy
face
that
hit me.
surrounded us.
I was terrified.
The pain was
yes,
excruciating,
but there was also
like my
a
very
sense of
soul
purpose,
was
of
being torn
rightness.
apart.
This was
But
what I had been
couldn't give up.
preparing for
The
all
fate of
these
not
years.
just our world,
Whether I had known
but
it or
countless
not,
others hung in
as
the balance.
Grandma Evelyn and
Drawing
I
on every
drove
ounce
through
of
the
strength
night,
I
she
possessed,
explained
I
more
pushed
about
back
what we were
against the
facing.
darkness.
I
There are
thought of my
places,
family,
she said,
my
her
friends,
eyes fixed
of
on the
all the
dark
people
road
I'd
ahead,
helped with my
where
gift.
the boundaries
I
between
thought of the
worlds
beauty
are
of our
thinner,
world,
places
of
where
all
great
the
power
worlds
has
I'd
been
glimpsed
wielded,
in my visions,
or great evil
and I thought of
committed.
the shadows.
The shadows
the
guard these
ancient
places,
guardians who had
but
watched
sometimes
over reality for
something
eons.
slips through.
With a final desperate surge
We were
of will,
headed to one
we
such
forced
place,
the breach closed.
an abandoned
there was a
industrial
sound
complex
like
on the
reality
outskirts of
itself,
the city,
screaming.
according to
And
Grandma
then
Evelyn.
silence.
It had once been the site of
I opened my
experiments
eyes
in quantum
to
physics,
find myself lying on the
experiments
cold
that had
concrete
torn
floor of
holes
the
in the
warehouse.
fabric of reality.
Grandma Evelyn was
the
kneeling
shadows
beside me,
have been
tears
fighting to
streaming
keep
down
these
her
breaches
face.
closed.
The
for
shadows
years,
swirled
she
around us.
explained.
Their
But
movements now calm,
something
and
on the
almost
other side
grateful.
has found a way to force
You
them
did
open.
it, Isabella.
If we don't
Grandma
stop it,
Evelyn
our
whispered,
world,
helping
and
me sit
countless
up.
others,
You
will be
closed the
overrun.
breach.
As the reality
As
of what
we
had
neared
just
our
happened sank
destination,
in, I
I
felt
could
a
feel
mix
the
of
wrongness
exhaustion,
in the air.
relief,
The shadows
and
here were
something
agitated,
else.
moving
A
in
sense of
patterns I had
completion.
never
I
seen
had
before.
faced my greatest
the very
challenge,
air
and against
seemed to
all
shimmer
odds,
and warp,
had emerged
as if the laws of
victorious.
physics were breaking down.
But as we made our way
parked
out
some
of the
distance
warehouse
away
on shaky
and
legs,
approached on foot.
I couldn't
The
shake
industrial
the feeling
complex
that this was
loomed
just
before
the
us.
beginning.
Its
The entity
abandoned
we had
buildings
forced back,
casting long,
it was still out there,
unnatural
still
shadows
hungry.
in the
Then there
moonlight.
were other weak
As we
points
drew
in
closer,
reality.
I could
Other
see
places
shadows
where the
figures
veil
flitting
between
the
worlds
structures.
was thin.
Their
movements
Our battle
frantic
was
and
won,
desperate.
but the war,
The air
was far
crackled
from
with an
over.
otherworldly energy.
In the
that made
days
my
and
skin
weeks
crawl.
that followed the incident
Each step
at the
closer to
warehouse,
the complex,
life took on a
felt like
surreal
wading
quality.
through molasses.
On the surface,
as if reality
everything
itself
seemed normal.
was resisting
I went
our
back to
presence.
school, hung out with
Isabella,
friends,
Grandma
did my
Evelyn
homework.
said.
But
Her voice
underneath
tight
it all
with tension
was the knowledge
what
that
we're
I
about
had
to
faced down a
face.
cosmic
It's
horror
beyond
and
anything
lived
you've
to tell the
encountered
tale.
before. Remember your
shadows
training.
were ever
Trust
present,
in the shadows,
but they were
and in
different
yourself.
now. There was
I
a new
nodded,
respect
swallowing
in the way
hard
they
against
moved
the
around
lump
me,
of fear in
a
my
sense of
throat.
camaraderie.
As we approached the
that
main
hadn't
building,
been there before.
a massive warehouse
They were no
with
longer
broken
just
windows
entities I
and
could
rusted
see.
metal siding.
They were allies,
I could feel the
comrades in
wrongness
arms,
emanating
Grandma
from
Evelyn
within.
stepped
It was
up my
like a
training,
black hole
pushing
of
me to
negative
develop
energy,
my abilities
sucking in
further.
everything around it.
What
We
happened
pushed
at the
open
warehouse
creaking
was just
door
the beginning,
and stepped inside.
she would say.
The
Her
interior
eyes
was a
serious.
nightmare of
We need to
twisted
be
metal
prepared
and
for what
pulsing
might come
otherworldly
next.
light. And so
In the
I
center
trained.
of the warehouse
I learned
floor,
to project my
a tear in
consciousness
reality
across
hung
vast
suspended
distances
in the air.
to see
It
through
was
the
like
eyes of
looking at a
shadows,
rip in the
half a
fabric of
world
the
away.
world.
I
honed my
jagged
ability
and
to
pulsing
sense
with
disturbances in
energy.
reality,
Shadow
to feel the
figures swarmed
ebb
around
and
the
flow
breach.
of energies
Their form,
most humans couldn't
stretching
even
and
comprehend,
distorting,
as they fought
but it
to
wasn't
keep
all
it closed.
cosmic battles,
But it
and
was a losing
interdimensional
battle.
threats.
As
There
we
were still
watched,
the day-to-day
horror-struck,
uses of my
a
gift,
tentacle of
the
pure
small ways
darkness
I could
snaked
help
through
people
the
in my
opening,
community,
followed by
I
another.
helped the police
And
locate missing
it's
persons,
coming through,
using my
Grandma
ability
Evelyn
to
whispered,
sense
her
lingering
face pale in
emotions
the
and
eerie
memories.
light.
I counsel
Isabella,
people
you
dealing
know
with
what you have
hauntings
to
or
do.
unexplained
I did
phenomena,
know, though
using
the
my
knowledge
knowledge
filled me with
to
terror.
bring them peace.
I had to use my gift,
One
my
particularly
connection to the
memorable
shadows,
case
to
involved
help
a young
seal
girl
the breach,
who was
but
terrified
doing so would
of
put
her
me in
own
direct
shadow.
contact.
Her parents
with
had taken her
whatever
to
was on the other
doctors and
side.
therapists,
Taking a deep
but
breath, I
nothing
stepped
seemed to
forward.
help.
The shadows
When they came
swirled
to
around
me,
me, desperate
their cold
for any
touch
solution,
familiar
I
and almost
immediately
comforting.
sensed the
I
problem.
closed my eyes
The
and
girl's
opened
fear
my
wasn't
mind,
irrational.
reaching out
Her
to
shadow
connect with
really
the
was
guardian
alive in a
entities.
sense. A minor spirit
The moment I made
had attached
contact
itself to her.
I was
drawn
assaulted by a
natural
wave of
sensitivity
alien
to the
thoughts
supernatural
and emotions.
With the help of the
shadows
shadow
were
guardians,
ancient,
their consciousness
able to
vast and
communicate with the
incomprehensible,
spirit,
but
and
underlying
convince
it
to
all
move
was a
on.
sense of
The
desperate
look of
urgency.
relief on the
They
girl's
needed my
face
help.
when she realized her shadow was just
Guided
a shadow
by
again,
instinct and years
was
of
something
training,
I'll never forget.
I began to
It
weave
was
my
moments like
consciousness
these
with theirs.
that made all
I could
the
feel
danger
the
and
power
responsibility
building, a force
worthwhile.
that transcended
But even
the
as I
physical
helped
world.
others
Together,
and continued
we
my
pushed
training,
against the
I
encroaching
couldn't shake
darkness,
the memory
fighting to close
of what
the breach.
I'd seen through
the entity
breach.
on the other side.
The entity
fought
we
back.
had forced
Tendrils
back,
of darkness
it was
lashed
still
out
out there,
waiting.
striking at my
I could
mind
feel
with
its terrifying
terrifying
force.
in the
Images
quiet hours
flooded
of the
my
night.
consciousness.
A malevolent
Worlds
presence
consumed
pressing against
by
the
chaos.
barriers of
Realities
our reality,
twisted beyond
searching
recognition.
for another way
An
in.
endless hunger that threatened to
Grandma
devour
Evelyn
everything.
sensed
I
my
screamed.
unease.
The sound
The battle
lost
is never
in the
truly
howling
over,
vortex
Isabella,
of energy
she told me
that
one
surrounded
evening,
us.
as we sat
the
in her
pain
garden,
was excruciating,
watching the shadows
like my very
lengthen as the
soul
sun
was being
set.
torn apart.
That's the burden
But
of our
I
gift.
couldn't give up.
We
The
stand
fate
as
of not
guardians,
just our
always
world,
vigilant,
but
always
countless
ready.
others
I
hung in the
nodded,
balance,
understanding
drawing
the
on
weight
every
of
ounce
her
of
words.
strength I possessed.
This was my
I
life
pushed
now,
back against
not
the
just a
darkness.
high school
I thought of my
student with an
family, my
unusual
friends,
ability,
of
but a
all the
protector
people
of
I'd helped with
reality
my
itself.
gift. I
It
thought
was a
of the
heavy
beauty of our
responsibility,
world,
of
but
all
one
the
I was
worlds
prepared
I'd
to
glimpsed
bear.
in my visions.
As if in
And I
response
thought
to
of
my
the
shadows,
thoughts.
the shadows
ancient
around us
guardians
stirred.
who had watched
I
over
felt a
reality
familiar
for
chill
eons,
run down my
with a
spine,
final desperate
and knew
surge
that
of
somewhere
will,
we
the
forced
veil
the breach
between
closed.
worlds was growing
There was
thin
a sound
once again.
like reality itself.
I stood up,
screaming,
brushing off
and
my
then
jeans.
Grandma
Silence.
Evelyn looked at me, a
I
mixture of
opened
pride
my
and
eyes
concern
to
in
find
her
myself
eyes.
lying on
Ready?
the cold
She
concrete
asked.
floor of the warehouse.
I took a deep breath,
Grandma Evelyn
feeling
was
the
kneeling
power of the
beside
shadows
me,
swirling
tears
around
streaming
me,
down her
through
face.
me. The
I
shadows
thought of all I had
swirled
learned,
around us,
all
their
I had
movements now
experienced.
calm and
I
almost
thought of the
grateful.
entity
waiting in the
You
darkness
did it,
between
Isabella.
worlds.
Grandma
And of
Evelyn
all the
whispered,
people in this
helping me
world
sit
and
up.
others
You
who were
closed the
counting on
breach.
me, as the
Even if they
reality of what
didn't
had
know
just
it.
happened sank
Ready,
in,
I
felt a
replied.
mix of
As we
exhaustion,
headed off into the
relief,
gathering dusk,
and
I
something
couldn't help
else.
but smile.
A sense
This
of
was my
completion.
life now.
I had faced my
Strange,
greatest challenge,
terrifying,
and against
wondrous,
all odds,
and more
had
important than I
emerged
could have ever
victorious.
imagined.
The shadows were
But
my
as we
allies,
made our way
the
out of the
space
warehouse
between
on
worlds,
shaky
my
legs,
battlefield,
I couldn't shake
and the
the
safety
feeling
of
that this was
reality,
just
my
the beginning.
responsibility.
The entity we had forced back,
It wasn't
was
the
still
life I
out
had
there,
expected.
still hungry.
And there were
But it
other
was
weak
mine,
points in
and I
reality.
wouldn't have it any other way.
places where the veil between worlds was thin. Our battle was won.
begun, but the war was far from over. In the days
The harsh
and weeks
glow
that
of my
followed the
smartphone
incident
screen
at the warehouse
illuminated
life
the
took on
dark
a
interior
surreal quality.
of my weathered
On the
2010
surface,
Honda Civic.
everything seemed normal.
It was
I went
11:43
back to
p.m.
school, hung
on a
out with
crisp
friends,
October
did
night
my
in
homework.
2023.
But underneath it all,
I had just
was the knowledge
accepted
that I had
what would
faced
be
down
my
a
cosmic
final
horror
ride request
and
of the
lived to
evening.
tell the tale.
As I navigated through the
shadows
rain-slicked
were ever
streets
present,
of Pinewood,
but they were
Oregon,
different now. I couldn't help but reflect on how I'd ended up here. A 34-year-old man that had used to chauffeuring strangers. They were no longer just entities I could see. 3 years earlier, they were allies. I had been laid off from my steady office job at a local printing training, pushing me to develop my abilities. No promising leads in sight. What happened at the warehouse was just the beginning. She would
just
say,
until I find
her
something
eyes
better,
serious.
I told myself.
We need to be prepared.
But days
for what
turned
might
into
come
weeks,
weeks into
and
months.
so I trained.
And before I knew
learned
it,
to
I
project
had become a full-time rideshare driver, to see through the eyes of shadows, toll on both me and my car. I honed my ability to sense disturbances now bore the battle scars of to feel the ebb and flow of energies mysterious most humans couldn't even comprehend. Cigarette burns, but it wasn't all cosmic battles and a pervasive interdimensional threat. No amount there were still the day-to-day uses of my vehicles, mileage, ways I could help people in my strange rattles. I helped the police had become my constant companions on the road, using my ability to sense lingering emotions wear and tear that weighed on me. I counseled people dealing with hauntings or unexplained phenomena, using my knowledge to bring them peace. And a few downright hostile. One particularly memorable case involved a young girl who was terrified, threatened of her, and even had a drunk passenger vomit all over my back seat. Each incident chipped away at my faith in humanity. When they came to me, desperate for any solution, I immediately sensed the problem. As I pulled into the parking lot of Gussie's Burger Shack, my favorite greasy spoon and frequent horn during slow nights had attached. I let out a weary sigh, drawn by the neon sign flickered to the supernatural, casting an with the help of the shadow guardians. The rain-dampened pavement, I was able to communicate my usual spirit, killed the engine and leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for just a girl's face. The ping of a realized her shadow was just a shadow again. I blinked, disoriented, and fumbled for my phone. It was moments like these now read that made all the danger and responsibility. I must have dozed off for a few minutes, but even as I held the screen and continued, the pickup location was only a few blocks away. Memory. My finger hovered over the accept button as I debated whether to call it a night or squeeze out there waiting. One last I could feel it sometime. Financial desperation won out over my better judgment. I accepted the ride against the pulled out of the parking reality, unaware searching for another that I was driving towards a nightmare that would forever change the course of my life. The battle is never truly over, Isabella, as I made my way to the pickup location. As we sat in her garden, light watching the shadows lengthen, creating a misty haze. That's the burden of our gift. The glow of the street. We stand as guardians. As I turned onto Maple Street, always ready, a sense of unease began to creep over the weight of her. This part of town had this was my life now, with not just a high school student with an unusual ability, but telling a story of reality itself. It was a heavy responsibility. I slowly rolled to a stop in front of a dilapidated convenience store, as if in response to my its windows dark, the shadows around us stirred. I felt a familiar chill run down my spine, around and knew that somewhere the veil. That's when I saw him emerge from the shadows of a nearby alley. Even from a distance, brushing off something about the man's appearance set off alarm bells in my mind. Concern he moved with an erratic, twitchy gait. Asked, his head snapping from side to side, feeling the power as if he were looking for unseen pursuers. As he drew closer, I thought of I could make out more details. All I had experienced heightened my I thought of the entity waiting in the darkness. The man appeared to be in his late 40s, and of all the people in this world with a shaved head who were counting on me dully in the weak light. Even if they didn't know it, dark sunglasses obscured his eyes. Despite the late headed off into the gathering dusk, his clothes were a study in contrast. This was my life. Skin-tight black jeans, strange, terrifying, wondrous, and more important than I could have ever imagined. Oversized, the shadows were my allies, riddled with space between worlds, my battlefield. As he reached for the car door, the safety of reality, I noticed his hands my responsibility. A voice in the back of my mind screamed, it wasn't the life I had drive away, to cancel the ride and go and home. I wouldn't have it any other way. Years of financial struggle and the ingrained habit of people-pleasing kept me rooted to the spot. The rear door opened, and a wave of foul the harsh glow of my smartphone screen nauseating illuminated the dark interior stale of my weathered 2010 chemical I couldn't quite place. It was 11:43 p.m. on a crisp October night in 2023, dip under and I had just accepted what would be my final ride to keep my voice steady. As I navigated through the rain, my greeting was met with silence. Pinewood, for a low, continuous I couldn't help but reflect on how I strained my ears. A 34-year-old man, reduced to chauffeuring from the back seat, around were like no language I'd ever heard before.
It was a guttural, rhythmic from my steady office that made the hairs on the back of my neck with bills piling up and no fighting to maintain my composure. I turned away from the curb and began driving towards the destination displayed on my phone. As we days turned into mumbling, weeks into months, punctuated before I knew occasional twitches, I had become a full-time ride-share driver through my seat. The job had taken its toll up the volume on the radio and my car, desperate to drown out the unsettling sounds from my passenger. The battle scars. But even as the familiar melodies filled the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a terrible, potentially fatal mistake. And a pervasive odor, the rhythmic no amount of windshield wipers cut through the vehicle's mileage and sky as I navigated the empty strange rattles and my knuckles were white on the steering constant companions, and I could feel beads of cold sweat. But it wasn't just the physical wear and tear every few seconds. The mental strain of dealing with an endless parade of catching glimpses of my unpleasant, many indifferent, and a few downright become more pronounced. Had left his entire body out, seeming to vibrate with barely contained energy, and even had a drum passenger vomit all over my back seat, rising and falling in a discordant melody that set my teeth on edge. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept conjuring up increasing terrifying scenarios. My favorite was greasy spoon and mentally ill during or something far worse. I let out that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. The neon sign, the possibilities swirled in my mind, eerie red glow across the rain-dampened pavement. I parked in my usual spot. As we turned onto a residential street in my seat, lined with run-down houses for just a moment, I noticed something that made my blood run jolted me awake. In the rear blinked, disoriented, I saw my passenger's hand. The clock now read 11:52 p.m. When it re-emerged, I caught a glint of metal that could only be one thing. I saw that the pickup location was only a few blocks away, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I desperately tried to think of a way out to call it a night or squeeze in. Slam on the brakes and last fair. Try to reason with him. Financial desperation won out over my better judgment. Any of these impulses, I accepted the ride. We had arrived out of the parking lot destination, unaware that I was driving towards a nightmare that would forever change the course of my life. A weathered for rent sign swayed in the wind as I made my way to the pickup location. The street was dark and deserted, with no signs of life in any of the neighboring homes. Distorted the glow of the streetlights. I managed as I turned onto Maple Street, a sense of unease began to creep over me. My words were cut short by a sudden sharp pain boarded up storefronts. It took my brain a moment to process what was happening. A story of the knife I had seen earlier was now buried in my flesh. I slowly rolled to a stop in front of a dilapidated convenience store. A strong arm, its windows around my throat, and its neon cutting off my air supply. I gasped and choked. My eyes hands instinctively flying up to claw at the arm. That's when I saw him emerge through the shadows of a nearby alley. I could hear my attacker's voice, something about the man's appearance, shouting in that same alarm bells in my mind. Language. He moved with an erratic, twitchy gait, foreign to my ears, snapping from side to side, as if he were looking for unseen pursuers. Spittle hit the back of my neck as he drew closer. I could make out more details that only heightened my apprehension. I could feel warm blood soaking through my shirt. The man appeared to be in his late 40s or early 50s. In that moment, with the shaved edges of my vision began to darken the weak light. I was dark sunglasses obscured his eyes. Despite the late hour and gloomy weather, the dreams I'd never pursued, were a study in the loved ones I'd neglected, skin-tight, they all flashed before my eyes, seemed to have been a painted montage of regret. Paired with an oversized, tattered primal survival riddled with holes and tears. With the last reserves for the car strength, I noticed his hands were trembling. A voice in the back of my mind my attacker from me to drive the blade for to cancel the ride. What followed was a years of financial struggle, and the ingrained habit of people-pleasing my battered Honda Civic on a lonely, the rear rain-soaked street and in the wave of foul odor. Time seemed to slow to a nauseating mixture of my life in the cramped confines of my car, and something chemical I couldn't quite felt like an eternity. The man slid into the back seat directly behind me as I battled against the arm crushing my windpipe. The pain in my side was excruciating, trying to keep my voice steady. A white-hot agony How are you tonight? That threatened to overwhelm me. My greeting was met with silence. I could feel my attacker trying to wrench the knife free, no doubt intending to plunge it into trying me to make out words. With every ounce of strength coming from the back seat, I clung to his arm. No language I ever heard digging into his flesh. It was a guttural, rhythmic chanting. He howled made the hairs on the back of my neck, a sound more animal than human, and redoubled his efforts to my composure. The car pulled away from the violently as we began driving. My blood smearing across the upholstery and dashboard. As we traveled, the mumbling filled my nostrils, punctuated by occasional twitches and jerks to create a nauseating cocktail. I gagged struggling to breathe the volume on the radio, and the overwhelming
desperate to drown out the unsettling sound
began to
passenger.
Black spots
even as the familiar melodies filled the car, in desperation I slammed my head
that I had just made
feeling
a terrible,
satisfying
potentially
crunch as my skull
mistake.
connected with my assailant's
The rhythmic
nose.
sweep of
His grip
windshield
on my throat
wipers
loosened
cut
for
through
just a
the
moment,
intensifying
allowing me
rain
to gulp
as
down
I navigated the
precious
empty
breath of
streets.
air.
My knuckles were white on the steering
Taking
wheel,
advantage
and
of
I
his
could feel
momentary
beads of cold
disorientation,
sweat
I
forming
fumbled
on
for
my
the door
forehead.
handle with my
Every
free
few
hand.
seconds.
If I could just
My
get
eyes
out
would
of the
dart
car,
to the rearview
maybe I'd
mirror,
have a chance.
catching glimpses
But
of
as
my
my fingers
unnerving
closed
passenger,
around the handle,
his twitching
I felt
had
a sharp
become more
yank
pronounced,
on my hair,
his entire
pulling
body
my head back
seeming
at a
to
painful
vibrate
angle.
with barely contained
No
energy.
escape.
The mumbling had
A
taken on
raspy
a
voice
fevered
hissed
pitch
in my ear,
rising
the
and falling
first
in a
coherent
discordant
words
melody
I'd heard from
that
him.
set my
His
teeth
breath
on
was
edge.
hot against
I
my
tried to
skin,
focus on the road
reeking of
ahead,
decay and
but my
madness.
mind kept
You're
conjuring
mine
up
now,
increasingly
forever.
terrifying
A fresh
scenarios.
wave of terror
Was he
washed
on
over me at
drugs?
these words.
Mentally ill?
What did he mean
or
by
something
forever?
far worse?
What sick,
that I couldn't
twisted
even
plans
begin
did this
to
lunatic
comprehend?
have for me?
The possibility
gave me a burst
in
of
my
desperate
mind,
energy,
each more
and I
frightening
thrashed
than the
wildly,
last.
my elbow connecting solidly with
As
his
we
ribs.
turned onto a residential
He
street,
grunted in pain,
lined with
his
run-down
grip
houses,
faltering just enough
I
for me
noticed
to
something
wrench the
that made
door
my
open.
blood run
cold.
Rain
In the
soaked
rearview
air
mirror,
rushed in.
I saw
A
my
stark
passenger's
contrast
hand
to the stifling
disappear into
atmosphere
the
inside
pocket
the
of his
car.
tattered
I
hoodie.
half fell.
When it re-emerged,
half tumbled out
I caught
onto
a
the wet
glint of
pavement.
metal that could
The
only
knife
be one
still
thing,
embedded in
a
my
knife,
side,
sending
my heart began to
shockwaves
race,
of agony
and
through
I could
my
hear the
body
blood
with
pounding
every
in my
movement.
ears.
I desperately tried to think of a way
For a
out of
moment,
this situation.
I lay there
Should I
gasping,
slam on the brakes
the cool
and run,
rain
try to
mingling with my
reason
sweat
with him,
and blood?
call for help?
Then I heard the
But
rear
before
door
I could
open,
act on
and
any of these
adrenaline
impulses,
surged through me
we
once
had
more.
arrived
At our
ignoring the
destination.
screaming protest of
I
my
pulled up in
wounded
front of
body.
a derelict
I
house
scrambled
with
to my
boarded
feet
up
and began
windows
to run,
and an overgrown
my
lawn.
attacker's footsteps
A weathered
pounded
for
behind
rent
me,
sign
accompanied
swayed
by
in the
that
wind,
same
creaking
incomprehensible
ominously.
chanting.
The street
now
was
raised
dark
to a
and
frenzied
deserted,
pitch,
with no signs of life
between
in
any of the
parked
neighboring
cars.
homes.
My bare feet
We're
slapping
here.
against the wet
I
asphalt.
managed to croak
Each
out.
impact
My
sent
voice
jolts
barely
of pain
above
through
a
my
whisper.
side.
I hope
But
you
fear
have a
drove
drove
me onward.
My words
I
were
risked a
cut
glance
short
over
by
my
a
shoulder
sudden
and
sharp
immediately
pain
wished
in
I
my
hadn't.
side.
It
The
took
man
my
was
brain a
gaining on
moment to
me,
process
his
what was
face
happening.
twisted into a
The
rictus
knife I
of
had seen
inhuman
earlier
rage
was now
in the
buried
dim
in my
street
flesh.
light. I could
Just
see
below
that
my
his
rib
sunglasses had
A
been
strong
knocked off
arm
during our
snaked
struggle,
around my throat,
revealing eyes
cutting
that
off my air
glowed with an
supply.
unnatural
I gasped and
phosphorescent
choked.
light. My
A
hands
scream
instinctively
tore from my
flying
throat
up
to
equal
claw
parts
the arm
pain and
restraining
terror.
me.
I pushed
Through
myself
the haze
harder,
of pain
my
and
lungs
panic,
burning as
I
I
could hear my
sprinted
attacker's
down the
voice,
deserted
no
street.
longer mumbling
in the
but
distance,
shouting in that
I
same
could see the
incomprehensible
welcoming glow of a
language.
24-hour gas
The words,
station.
though
If I
foreign
could
to
just
my
make
ears,
it there, maybe
dripped
I'd be
with
safe.
malice and
But
rage.
with each step, I could feel
Spittle
my
hit the back of my neck as he
screamed.
screamed.
The knife in my
His grip
side
tightening
felt
with
like it
each
was on
passing
fire, and my
second.
vision was
I
starting
could feel
to blur.
warm blood
The gas
soaking through
station
my
seemed
shirt,
impossibly
spreading
far
across
away,
the driver's
growing
seat.
more distant
In that
with
moment,
each labored
as the
breath.
edges
of my vision began to darken.
Just as I
felt
was
my legs
certain
begin to
I
give
was
out,
going to
headlights
die.
appeared
All the
around
missed
the corner.
opportunities,
A car
the
was
dreams
approaching,
I'd never
its
pursued,
horn blaring.
the loved
as the
ones
driver
I'd
spotted
neglected.
my
They
stumbling
all
form
flashed
in the
before
road.
my eyes
I
in a
waved
cruel
my
montage
arms
of
frantically,
regret,
screaming
but something
for help.
deep within
the
me,
car
some
screeched to
primal
a halt
survival
beside me,
instinct,
and I
refused to
nearly
give up.
wept with relief
With the last
as I saw the
reserves of my
taxi
strength,
sign on
I
its
reached
roof.
down and
the
grabbed
driver,
the arm,
a
holding the
middle-aged
knife.
woman with
Preventing
kind
my
eyes,
attacker
took
from
one
withdrawing
look at
the
my
blade
blood
for
for
another
another
strike.
pale face.
What
before
followed
throwing
was
open
a
the passenger
desperate
door.
struggle for survival.
Get in!
She
Played
shouted,
out in the
her eyes
confines
wide
of my
with
battered
alarm.
Honda
I
Civic.
didn't need to
on
be
a
told
lone
twice.
I dove into the
Rain-soaked
taxi,
street in the middle
slamming
of the
the door
night.
behind me.
Time seemed
just
to
as my
slow to a
pursuer's
crawl
fingers grazed
as I
the
fought
back
for
of
my
my
life
shirt.
in the
The
cramped
driver
confines of my
floored the
car.
accelerator
Every
and we peeled
second
away from the
felt like an
curb
eternity.
with a squeal of
Each
tires.
breath a monumental
As we
effort.
sped off into
As I
the night,
battled against
I
the
twisted
arm
in my
crushing
seat
my
to look out the
windpipe.
rear window.
The pain
my
in my
attacker
side
stood
was
in the middle of the road,
excruciating.
his
A
glowing
white-hot
eyes
agony
fixed on the
that
retreating
threatened
taxi.
to overwhelm
Even
me.
through the closed
I could
windows
feel my
and the
attacker
sound
trying
of the
to
engine,
wrench the knife
I could
free.
hear
hear his
no doubt intending to plunge it into me again,
echoing
with
through
every
the night.
ounce of
I
strength
slumped
I
back
could muster.
in the seat.
I clung
my
to his
body
arm,
trembling
my fingers
uncontrollably,
digging into
as
his
the
flesh
full
hard
weight
enough
of what
to
had
draw
just
blood.
happened
He
began to
howled
sink
in
in.
rage,
The
a sound
adrenaline
more
was wearing
animal
off,
than human,
leaving me
and
weak
redoubled
and
his efforts to
disoriented.
break free.
The knife was
The
still
car
lodged
rocked
in my side
violently as
a
we
constant,
grappled, my
throbbing
blood smearing
reminder of
across
how
the
close
upholstery
I'd
and
come to
dashboard.
death.
Hospital,
The coppery scent
I managed to
filled
croak
my
out to the
nostrils,
driver,
mixing
who
with
was
the
already
attacker's
dialing
body
911 on her
to
cell
create a
phone.
nauseating
Please,
cocktail.
hospital.
I gagged, struggling
As
to
the
breathe
taxi
through the
sped through the
chokehold
rain
and the
slick
overwhelming
streets
towards
stench.
the nearest emergency
My vision
room.
began to tunnel.
I closed my
Black
eyes and
spots
tried
down
to steady
the
my
edges
breathing.
of my sight.
But
In
all I could see
desperation,
was
I
the
slammed
image
my
of
head
those
back,
glowing
feeling a
eyes,
satisfying
and all I
crunch
could hear
as
was
my
that
skull
inhuman
connected with my
voice
assailant's
whispering,
nose.
"You're
His
mine
grip
now,
on my
forever."
throat loosened for just a moment.
The emergency
allowing me
room
to
was a
gulp
blur
down
of bright
a
lights
precious
breath
urgent
of air,
voices and sharp sensations.
Taking advantage of his momentary disorientation,
I fumbled for the door handle with my free hand.
If I could just get out of the car, maybe I'd have a chance. But as my fingers closed around the handle, into surgery. I felt a sharp yank. The knife finally removed from my side under the harsh glare of operating room lights. No escape. When I fully came to, I found myself in a sterile hospital room. The steady beep of monitors, his breath was hot against my skin, were a stark contrast to the nightmarish events of the previous night. Forever. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a terrible dream. But the dull ache in my forever, and the bandages wrapped around my plans torso did this lunatic have for me? The thought gave me a burst of desperate energy, and I thrashed wildly. My elbow was connecting solidly with his ribs. You're a lucky man, he grunted in pain, adjusting my his grip faltering just enough for me to wrench the vital organs by mere centimeters. Rain a little to the left, and a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the car. Grim. I half fell. I tried to tumbled out onto the wet pavement. Was raw, the knife still embedded in my side, a lingering reminder of the shockwaves of agony through my body. With every nurse offered me some ice chips, which I gratefully accepted. I lay as the cool slivers melted on my tongue, mingling with my sweat and blood. I became aware of two police Then I heard the rear door just outside my room, and adrenaline speaking in hushed tones. Me once more. Ignoring the screaming protest of my detective with salt and pepper hair, I scrambled to my feet and began to run. He introduced himself as Detective Hawkins, pounded behind me, and asked if I felt up to answering some incomprehensible chanting. I nodded weakly, now raised to a frenzy, catch the maniac who had darted between parked cars. But as I recounted the events of the night, I could see skepticism growing in the detective's eyes through my side. When I described my attacker's glowing eyes, I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Hawkins exchanged a look with his partner that I recognized. His face twisted into a rictus of inhuman rage. I was either hallucinating in the dim streetlight or lying. I could see that his sunglasses Mr. Wilson had been knocked off during our struggle. His revealing eyes that glowed with an unnatural, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. A scream tore from my throat, equal parts pain and terror. I pushed myself the glowing eyes, my lungs burning as I sprinted down the deserted stress and blood loss in the distance may have affected your perception. I could see the welcoming glow of a 24-hour surge of frustration and fear. If I could just make it believe maybe I'd be safe. If they didn't take my account seriously, I could feel my strength ebbing. I know how it sounds, I insisted. Felt like it was on fire, and my vision was starting to blur. But I'm telling you the truth. The gas station seemed impossibly far away, but I could see he wasn't convinced with each labored breath. He asked a few more questions about the ride request. Just as I felt my legs begin to give out, and any headlights appeared around the corner, I could remember about my attacker. Its horn I provided as much detail as I could, my stumbling form in the road, that something would lead them frantically, screaming as the detective was wrapping up, screeched to a halt beside me, and I nearly wept with relief as there must be evidence in my car. Blood, fingerprint, something. A middle-aged We've already impounded your vehicle, Hawkins took one look at my blood. Our forensics team is going over it with a fine-tooth comb. The passenger but I have to warn you, Mr. Wilson, the results so far are wide with alarm. Inconclusive. I didn't need to be told twice. Ran down my spine. I dove into the taxi. What do you mean? Slamming the door behind me. Hawkins just as my pursuers seemed to decide that honesty was the best approach. The driver floored the blood we found in the car, and we peeled away from the curb. There are no fingerprints other than your own. As we sped off into the night, fibers, I twisted to suggest anyone else was in that vehicle. My attacker stood in the middle of the road, his glowing eyes fixed on the retreating taxi. I knew what had happened. I had the knife wound and the sound of the engine. But if there was no evidence of my attacker of frustration, get some rest, Mr. Wilson. I slumped back in the seat, towards the door, my body trembling uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I sank back. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me weak and disoriented. Was I going crazy? The knife was still lodged in my side. The financial struggling, the late nights finally taken their toll on my sanity. I managed to the pain in my side was real. Who was already dialing 911 on her cell phone. Please. Hospital. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. As the taxi sped through the rain-slick streets towards the nearest I saw those glowing eyes. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. But all I could see was the image of those glowing eyes, on the small and all I could hear was that inhuman voice that hadn't been there before. Your mind, a small, crumpled piece of paper with words. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights. Script. Urgent voices and sharp I reached out and unfolded. I drifted in and out of consciousness, written in English, doctors and nurses, but in a hand so shaky it was barely a jumbled mess in my pain-addled mind forever. At some point, I was wheeled into surgery. Cold as I realized the knife finally removed from my side under the harsh glare of operating room lights. The monster who
When
had
I
tried
fully
to kill
came
me
to,
had
I
somehow
found myself
managed
in
to
a
slip
sterile
past the
hospital
police.
room.
The hospital
steady beep of
security
monitors
and leave
and
the
the
antiseptic
antiseptic
smell were a
I jabbed
stark
frantically at
contrast
the
to
call
the
button,
nightmarish events
needing to
of the
alert
previous
someone,
night.
anyone.
For a
to
moment
this
I
new
wondered if it had
development.
all been a
But as a
terrible
nurse
dream.
rushed
But the
in,
dull ache in my
responding to my
side and the
apparent
bandages
distress,
wrapped
I
around my
looked down
torso
at my hands
were
and felt my
undeniable
stomach
proof
drop
of the
the
horror
note
I
was
had
gone.
endured.
The days that
A
followed my
kind-faced
release from the
nurse
hospital
noticed I was
were a
awake
blur
and
of
came to check on
paranoia
me.
and sleepless
"You're a lucky
nights.
man,"
Every
she said,
shadow
adjusting
seemed to
my
hold a
IV
threat.
drip.
Every
The knife
unexpected
missed your vital
sound
organs by
sent me
mere
a centimeters.
centimeters.
I
I
moved
moved
in
into
with
the
my
left
sister Megan, unable to
She
face the
trailed
prospect
off,
of being
her
alone
expression
in my
grim.
small apartment.
I tried
She
to
had been
speak,
horrified by
but
my
my throat
ordeal
was raw
and
and
insisted I
painful
stay with her
A
until I
lingering
felt safe
reminder
again.
of the chokehold
But would
I'd
I
been
ever
subjected
truly
to.
feel
The
safe
nurse
again?
offered me
The
some
police
ice chips,
investigation
which
had
I
a dead
gratefully
end,
accepted.
with no
As the
physical
cool
evidence,
slivers
and
melted
my
on my
increasingly
tongue, I
questionable
became aware of
testimony.
two police
They had
officers
little to
standing
go
just
on.
outside my
Detective
room,
Hawkins
speaking in
had
hushed
gently
tones.
suggested that I seek
One of them,
counseling to
a
deal with the
grizzled
trauma of
detective
the
with
attack.
salt and pepper
It
hair
was clear he
entered the
believed
room.
that my
He
memories
introduced
of glowing
himself as
eyes
Detective
and
Hawkins
inhuman chanting
and asked if I
were
felt
nothing
up
more
to
than
answering some
stress-induced
questions.
delusions.
I nodded weakly.
I knew
eager
better.
to help catch
the
the
note
maniac
in
who
the
had attacked
hospital.
me.
Even
But
as
as
I
I
recounted the events
before
of the
anyone
night,
else could
I
see
could
it,
see
was
skepticism
this
growing
was
in the
far from
detective's
over.
eyes. My
When
attacker
I
was still out
described
there
my attacker's
watching,
glowing
waiting for
eyes
his
and
chance to finish what he'd
incomprehensible
started.
language.
Hawkins
Megan
exchanged
did her
a
best
look
to
with
help
his
me
partner
recover,
that I
both
recognized
physically
all
and
too
mentally.
well. She
They
cooked
clearly
nourishing
thought
meals,
I was either
changed my bandages,
hallucinating
and
or
listened
lying.
patiently as I recounted
Mr.
my
Wilson,
fears.
Detective
But I could
Hawkins
see
said,
the
his
worry
tone
in her
carefully
eyes,
neutral.
the way she'd glanced
I
at me when
understand
she
you've
thought
been
I
through a
wasn't looking.
traumatic
She was
experience.
afraid too.
But are you
not
certain
of my
about
attacker,
these
but of
unusual
what this
details?
trauma
The
might
glowing
be doing
eyes,
to my mind.
the strange language.
One night,
It's
about
possible
2
that the
weeks
stress
after
of
the
the
attack,
blood loss
I
may
woke
have
suddenly,
affected your
drenched
perception
in
of
sweat.
events.
The nightmare
I felt
had been
surge
vivid.
of frustration
I was
and
back
fear.
in my car.
They had to
the
believe
knife
me.
sliding
If they
into
didn't
my
take my
flesh
account
over and
seriously,
over again.
how would
as
they
those
ever catch this
glowing
monster?
eyes bored
I know
into
how it
my
sounds,
soul
I insisted,
as
my
I lay
voice
there
hoarse and weak.
trying to calm
But I'm
my
telling you
racing
the
heart.
truth.
A
Every
sound
word
from
of it.
outside the window
Hawkins
caught
caught
my
my
attention. I could
attention.
see he wasn't
It was the
convinced.
chanting.
He asked a few
That
more questions about the
guttural
rhythmic
rhythmic sound
sound
I'd heard in the
taken.
car,
and
my
any
blood turned to
identifying
ice in my
features
veins
I could
as I
remember
slowly
about
turned
my
my head
attacker.
towards the
I
window.
provided as much
There, pressed
detail
against
as I
the
could,
glass, was a
desperately
face,
hoping that
pale,
something would
hairless,
lead them to the
with
truth.
eyes that glowed and
As the
unearthly
detective was
green in the
wrapping up,
darkness.
a thought struck me. I
My
tried to
car,
scream,
I said suddenly,
but no
there must be
sound
evidence
came
in my
out.
car.
I was
Blood,
paralyzed with
fingerprints,
terror,
something.
unable to move.
We've
or
already
call for
impounded
help
your
as the
vehicle,
face leered
Hawkins
at me.
replied.
Its mouth
Our forensics
opened in a
team is
grotesque
going over it with a
smile,
fine-tooth
revealing
comb.
rows of
But
sharp,
I have to warn you,
yellowed
Mr.
teeth.
Wilson,
The
mine,
results so far are
mouthed
inconclusive. Forever. A chill ran down my spine. As suddenly as
What
it
do
had
you mean,
appeared, the face
inconclusive?
was gone. Hawkins
I lay
hesitated,
there,
shaking
then seemed to decide that
uncontrollably
honesty
for what
was the
felt
best
like
approach.
hours. When
The
the
blood we
first
found
light
in
of
the car
dawn
is
began
all
to
yours.
filter through the
There are
curtains,
no
I
fingerprints
finally
other
found
than
the
your
strength
own.
to stumble
No
out
hair,
of bed
no
and
fibers,
wake Megan.
nothing to suggest
She
anyone
listened
else
to my
was in that
panicked
vehicle
account
last
with
night.
growing alarm.
I felt the
then
room
insisted
start
on
to
calling the
spin.
police.
How was
Officers
this possible?
arrived within the
I knew
hour,
what had happened.
but their search
I
of
had
the
the knife
property
wound
turned
to
up
prove
nothing.
it.
But
No
if there was
footprints in the
no
soft
evidence
earth
of my
beneath the
attacker,
window,
no
get some
signs
rest,
of
Mr.
disturbance
Wilson,
anywhere.
Hawkins said, moving towards
Mr. Wilson,
the door.
the
We'll be
lead
in
officer
touch
said
if we
gently,
need any further
"Is
information."
it possible you were having a
As the
particularly
detective
vivid
left,
nightmare?
I sank back
Given
into
what
my
you've been
pillows,
through, it would be
my mind
perfectly
reeling.
understandable. Was I going
wanted
crazy?
to scream
And the
at him,
stress of my
to make him
job,
understand
the
that this was
financial
real,
struggles,
that I
the
was
late
in
nights
genuine
finally taken their
danger.
toll on
But
my
the words
sanity.
died in
But
my
no,
throat
the pain
as
in
I
my
saw
side
the
was
pitying
real.
looks
The terror I had
exchanged
felt was
between
real.
the officers
and my sister.
They thought I was
I
losing
closed
my
my
mind,
eyes,
maybe
trying
I
to make
was.
sense of it all.
In the days
But
that
as soon
followed,
as
I
my
barely
lids
slept.
shut, I
saw
spent
those
hours
glowing eyes
researching
staring
obscure
back at me.
languages,
I jerked
trying to
awake
find
with a gasp,
anything
my heart
that matched
racing.
the
chanting.
It was
I'd
then
heard
that
I
I
scoured
noticed
news
something
reports
on the
for any
small table
similar
beside
attacks,
my bed,
any mention
something
of
that
glowing
hadn't been there
eyes
before,
or
a
inhuman
small
assailants.
crumpled piece of
But
paper
my
with
searches
words
yielded nothing
scrawled
but
in
conspiracy
jagged, unfamiliar
theories
script
and horrible
With trembling
plots.
hands, I
Megan
reached
tried
out
to
and
convince
unfolded
me
it.
to see
The
a
message
therapist,
was short,
but I
written in
refused.
English.
How could
but
I
in a hand
explain
so
this to a
shaky
mental
it
health
was
professional
barely legible,
without sounding completely
not
insane?
over.
Mine forever.
Instead, I threw
See you
myself
soon.
into my online
My
work,
blood ran cold
desperate
as
for
I
any
realized the
distraction from the
implications.
constant
He
fear
had been
that
here
plagued
in my
me.
hospital room
But no
while
matter
I
how
slept.
hard
The monster
I tried to
who
convince
tried
myself
to kill me,
it had all been
somehow
a
managed
hallucination,
to slip past
a part
the
of me
police.
knew the
The
truth.
hospital security
the monster was real,
and leave this
and it
chilling
wasn't
message
finished
with me yet.
I jabbed frantically at the
One
call
evening,
button,
about
needing
a month
to alert
after the
someone
attack,
anywhere
anyone.
Megan
to
had to leave
development.
for a late shift
But
at
as
the
a
hospital
nurse
where
rushed
she worked
in,
as a nurse.
responding to
I
my
assured her
apparent
I'd be
distress.
fine on my
I
own
looked
for a
down
few
at my
hours,
hands,
even
and felt
managing
my
a
stomach
weak
drop.
smile
The
as she
note was
hesitated
gone.
at the door.
The days that followed my release from the hospital
As soon as she was gone,
were a blur
I
of
double-checked all
paranoia
the
and
locks
sleepless
and
nights.
settled in front of my
Every
laptop,
shadow seemed to hold a
determined
threat.
to distract
Every
myself with work
unexpected
until she
sound
returned.
sent my heart
But as the
racing.
hours ticked
I'd moved
by,
in with my
an
sister
odd
Megan,
sensation began
unable
to
to
creep
face
over
the
me.
prospect
The
of being
air in the
alone
apartment felt
in my
heavier,
small apartment,
charged with an
She'd been
unseen
horrified
energy
by my
that
ordeal
made the hairs
and
on the back of my
insisted I
neck
stay with
stand
her
up until I felt safe again.
A soft
But would I
scratching
ever
sound from the
truly
hallway
feel
outside
safe
the
again?
apartment door.
The police
made me
investigation had
freeze.
hit a dead
It could
end,
have been anything.
with no physical
a neighbor's
evidence,
cat,
the
and my
building
increasingly
settling.
questionable
But deep down I
testimony.
knew
They
he
had
had
little
found
to go
me.
on.
The
Detective
scratching grew
Hawkins
louder, more
had gently
insistent.
suggested
I could
that
hear
I
that
seek
chanting
counseling
again,
to deal with the
muffled
trauma
but
of the
unmistakable.
attack.
My
It was
eyes
clear he
darted around
believed
the
that
room,
my memories
looking
of
for a
glowing
weapon, an
eyes
escape
and
route,
inhuman
anything.
chanting
But I knew it was
were
nothing
futile.
more than
Whatever this thing
stress-induced
was,
delusions.
it wasn't human.
I
It
knew
wouldn't be
better.
stopped by
The
locked
note
doors
in
or
the
desperate
hospital,
pleas.
even if it had
As the door
vanished
began to
before anyone else
splinter
could see
under
it,
an inhuman
was
assault,
proof that
I
this
closed
was
my
far
eyes
from
and
over.
waited for the
My attacker
inevitable.
was still out
The
there
chanting
watching,
grew louder,
waiting for his
drowning
chance
out
to
the
finish
sound
what
of
he'd
my
started.
own terrified
Megan did her
heartbeat.
best to
In
help me
those
recover.
final moments,
both physically
as the door
and mentally.
gave way
She
with a
cooked
deafening
nourishing
crack.
meals.
I found
changed
myself
my
wishing
bandages,
I'd never
and listened
accepted that
patiently as I
fateful
recounted my
request.
fears.
If only
But
I
I
could
trusted
see
my
the
instincts.
worry in her eyes.
If only I'd driven
the way
away
she
when I
glanced at me
first
when
saw
she
him
thought I
emerge
wasn't looking
from that alley.
She was afraid
But it was too late
not
for
of my
regrets
attacker,
now.
but of what this trauma
The last
might
thing
be
I
doing
saw
to
as
my
I
mind.
opened my eyes was a
One
pair
night,
of
about
glowing
2 weeks after
green
the attack,
orbs
I
floating
woke
in the
suddenly,
darkness,
drenched
drawing
in sweat.
closer.
The
and
nightmare
closer.
had been
Then
vivid.
mercifully
I was
everything
back in
went
my
black.
car.
I don't
The
know how
knife
long I was
sliding into my
unconscious.
flesh
When
over
I came
and
to
over again,
I
as
found
those
myself in
glowing
complete
eyes
darkness,
bored into my
lying
soul
on a cold,
as I
damp
lay there,
surface.
trying
The
to
air
calm
was
my
thick
racing
with the
heart.
smell of decay,
A
and
sound
something
from
else,
outside the
something
window caught
ancient
my
and
attention.
utterly alien.
It was the chanting.
As my
That
eyes
same
adjusted to the gloom,
guttural rhythmic
I became
sound
aware
I'd
of
heard in the
movement
car.
around me.
My blood
Shadowy
turned to
figures
ice in my
flitted at the
veins
edges of
as
my
I
vision,
slowly turned my head
accompanied
towards
by
the
that
window.
same
There,
chanting
pressed against
I'd come
the glass,
to dread.
was a
I
face,
tried to move,
pale,
but my limbs
hairless,
felt leaden,
with eyes that
unresponsive,
glowed,
and unearthly
suddenly a
green
face
in the dark
loomed
over me, the face of my
I
attacker.
tried to scream,
but in the dim
but
light,
no sound
I could
came
see
out.
him clearly
I was
for the
paralyzed
first time,
with terror,
and what I
unable
saw
to
made my
move or
blood
call
run
for help
cold.
as the face
His
leered at
skin
me.
was a
Its
sickly
mouth
shade of
opened
grey,
in a grotesque
stretched
smile,
taut over an elongating
revealing
skull.
rows of sharp,
Those glowing
yellowed
eyes were
teeth,
set deep in sunken
mine,
sockets,
it
and his
mouthed
mouth was
silently,
filled with row
forever.
upon row of needle-sharp
Then, as
teeth.
suddenly as it
He
had
spoke,
appeared, the
and
face
to my
was
shock,
gone.
I understood
I lay
him,
there,
shaking uncontrollably.
chosen one,
for what
he
felt
hissed,
like
his
hours,
voice like gravel
when the first
scraping
light of
against
dawn
metal.
began to
You
filter
have been
through
selected
the
for a
curtains.
great purpose.
I finally found
What?
the strength to stumble
are
out
you?
of bed.
I managed
and wake
to
Megan.
croak out,
my
She
voice
listened to
barely
my
above a
panicked
whisper.
account with
The
growing
creature's
alarm,
mouth twisted
then
into
insisted
what might
on
have been
calling
a
the police.
smile. Officers
We are the
arrived within the hour,
watchers, he said.
but their
We have
search of
existed
the
in the
property
shadows
turned
of
up
your
nothing.
world for
no
millennia,
footprints in the soft
guiding
earth beneath the
humanity's
window,
evolution
no signs
from
of
the
disturbance.
darkness
As he
anywhere.
spoke, memories
Mr.
began
Wilson,
to flood back.
the lead officer
not just
said
of the
gently,
attack, but of things
"Is it possible
I'd never
you were having a
experienced?"
particularly
I saw
vivid
flashes
nightmare?
of ancient
Given what you've
civilizations,
been through, it would
of
be
dark
perfectly
rituals
understandable.
performed in hidden
I wanted
places.
to scream
I
at
saw
him,
beings
to
like
make him
my captor
understand that
walking
this
among
was
humans,
real,
that I was
whispering
in
secrets
genuine
and sowing
danger.
chaos.
But the words
Your kind
died
calls
in
us
my
by
throat
many names.
as I saw the
The creature
pitying
continued.
looks
Demons,
exchanged between
aliens,
the officers
monsters,
and my
but
sister.
we are so
They
much
thought
more.
I was losing
We
my
are the
mind.
shapers of
Maybe
your
I was.
destiny.
In
The
the days that
architects
followed,
of your
I
nightmares
barely
slept.
I spent hours researching
to deny
obscure
the
languages,
impossible truths
trying
being
to find
revealed to me,
anything
but
that
deep
matched
down I
the
knew he was
chanting
right.
I'd heard.
Somehow I had
scoured
always
news
known.
reports
Why
for any
me?
similar
I
attacks,
asked,
any
dreading
mention
the
of glowing
answer.
eyes.
The creature's
or
eyes
inhuman
seemed to glow
assailants.
brighter.
But my
You
searches
were chosen
yielded
long
nothing
ago,
but conspiracy
marked from birth
theories
for this
and
moment.
horror movie
Your
plots.
bloodline
Megan
carries a
tried to
unique
convince
genetic marker, to see a therapist, one that makes you compatible with our
How
kind.
could I explain this to a mental health professional without sounding completely
implications of
insane?
his words?
Instead, I threw myself into my online work.
You will be the
bridge,
distraction
from the constant
reaching out a long,
clawed hand.
But
to
no matter
my
how
face,
hard
I tried to convince myself it had all been a
unable to move
hallucination.
away.
Through you, our races will merge. The monster will be the progenitor of a new species
with me yet.
One that will rule
One evening,
about
a month
after the attack, Megan had to leave for a late shift at the hospital where she waited
as
my
a nurse.
situation hit
I assured her
this
I'd be
wasn't
fine
just
on my
about
own
me
for a few
anymore.
hours.
The
Even
fate of
managing
humanity
a weak
itself
smile
hung in the balance.
as she hesitated
I
at the
won't do
door.
it, I said, trying to inject strength
As soon as she
into
was
my
gone,
voice.
I double-checked before I help you, and settled in front of my laptop. Was like determined to distract myself. My dear, until she returned, he said. But as the hours ticked by, you don't have a choice. An odd sensation as he spoke, I felt a sharp pain in my side. The air in the apartment, right where the knife had charged me with an unseen energy. The wound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up suddenly felt like it was on fire. A soft scratching sound in agony as the creature placed his hand over the freeze. It could have been anything. Already been a neighbor's cat, he said. The building settling, almost gentle. But deep down I knew, even now, he had found me within you. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. The first I could hear that chanting again, muffled but unmistakable bonds. My eyes darted around the room to wake up, looking for a weapon and escape with each passing moment. But I knew I could feel something changing. Whatever this thing was, my vision sharpened. It colors becoming more vivid. I could hear the thoughts of the other creatures. As the door began to splinter under an alien minds, I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable. The chanting grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own humanity slipping away with each passing second. In those final moments, as the door gave way with a deafening crack, I found myself wishing I'd never accepted. I felt my mind expanding, feeling only I'd trusted my instincts. If only I'd driven away when I saw the rise and fall of civilizations. But it was too late for regrets now. I saw the true history of our world. The last thing I saw as a history in which humanity was a pair of glowing green orbs, bred and cultivated by these otherworldly beings for their own inscrutable purposes. Everything went black, and through I don't know how long I was unconscious. One thought echoed in my mind. I found myself until it drowned out everything else, lying on a cold, damp surface forever. The air was thick with the smell of decay in this something else, damp place, something that exists somewhere between realities. Time has lost. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, weeks, I became aware of movement around me. An endless shadowy figures flitted at the edges of my vision. My body is no longer by that same chanting detached horror. As my skin tried to move, but my limbs felt as my fingers elongated to wicked claws. Suddenly a face loomed over my side. The face has become a pulsing organic thing. But in the dim light, a gateway through which the alien essence floods my system. And what I saw made my blood run cold. It's the changes to my mind. His skin was a sickly shade of grey. Memories that aren't my own elongated skull, my consciousness. Those glowing eyes were set fought in the shadows of human history, and his mouth was filled with row that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. He spoke, I can feel my human identity slipping away. Welcome, replaced by something vast and unknowable. His voice like gravel scraping against the watchers. You have been selected for a great come and go. Performing arcane rituals. What are you? And I managed to croak out my voice that I barely understand. All too the creature's mouth twisted into with a mixture of reverence and we are the watchers, he said, as if I'm both the Messiah in the shadows of your world for millennia. In moments of humanity's evolution, I think of from the darkness. I wonder if she's looking for memories began to she's realized the truth, not just of the attack, but of things I hope she's given up, moved on with her life. I saw flashes of ancient civilization that she might still be searching. Might one day cross paths with these creatures. I saw beings like my captor walking among humans, whispering secrets. I try to hold on to my humanity. Your kind calls us by many names before all this, the creature continued. But it's getting harder with each passing moment. But we are so much more. Thoughts are becoming we are the shapers of your destiny. The inhuman desires of your becoming my desires. I wanted to scream, and then one day, to deny the impossible truths it's being revealed to tell down here. But deep down, everything changes. Somehow I had always known. Why me? Companion, I asked, suddenly intensifies, becoming the creature's eyes seem to glow brighter. You were chosen long ago. My body contort for this moment. Bones cracking and reforming, carries muscles tearing and reknitting. I feel as if I'm being turned inside out. Every atom of my being unmade and reshaped. As I began to understand the implications around of his words, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. You will be the bridge, he said. I see anticipation out a long, glowing hand to caress my face. This is what they've been waiting for. I recoiled from his touch. Just when I think I found myself unable to move away. When I'm certain through you, our races will merge. Release. You will be the progenitor of a new species. The pain vanishes as suddenly as it came, both leaving me gasping on the cold stone floor. Tears streamed down my face as the full weight of my situation hit me. Then slowly I opened my eyes. The world wasn't just about me anymore. Perhaps I had. The fate of humanity I've never seen before danced at the edges of my I said, I can hear the thoughts of the creatures around me. I'll die before I help you. As if they were speaking. The creature's laughter was like and when I looked down at my hands, oh my dear, I see skin that shimmers with another worldly you don't have a choice. Fingers tipped with razor-sharp I felt a sharp pain in my side, right where the knife had pierced me weeks ago, extending a hand to help me which had been healing well.
Suddenly felt like it was on fire, and the voice that screamed in agony as the creature placed his hand over resonant with power that makes the very air has already been planted. He said, complete, I say, voice almost and part of me recoils at the truth now. It grows within you. But that part is soon small. You will become one of us, a fading echo of the man I once was. I thrashed against my invisible the hybrid, the desperate to escape world, to wake up rises to its full height and surveys its domain. I could feel the power thrumming through my veins. My vision sharp, the knowledge of colors becoming more fingertips. I could hear the thoughts of the other creatures in the room, a cacophony of alien minds, revealing secrets that would drive a human mad. But I am no longer human. I whimpered, feeling my humanity slipping away with each passing second. Their Messiah. Please, no, I can sense their thoughts, deaf ears, a mixture of awe, the transformation and anticipation. I felt my mind expanding for this moment, filling with knowledge and memories of a being that bridges their world. I saw the rise and fall of civilization. As I take in my surroundings with my new enhanced senses, I realize we are in a vast underground history in which humanity walls are covered in intricate carvings, depicting the history of the these otherworldly beings for their own inscrutable purposes, understanding the complex symbology that tells a tale of manipulation and growing louder until it drowned out everything else. Mine now, forever. I don't know how long I've been still strange in to this my ears. Dark, damp the leader of the Watchers that exists somewhere between now, firstborn, we begin the next Time phase. Has lost all meaning. You will return to the surface world to live among the humans together in an endless cycle of pain. But you will carry our essence, our power. My body is no longer. You will prepare the way for our emergence. Detached horror as my skin takes on a greyish hue. A small part of me, as my fingers, the last remnant of my humanity, recoils. The wound in my side, but that voice is drowned out by the chorus of alien minds. The alien floods my systems. I nod, but it's the changes to my mind cosmic drama terrify me. The next memories that aren't my own crowd, my conscious little meaning here. Ancient wars fought in the shadows of human history. The Watchers teach me to control my no mortal mind was meant to shield my true nature. I can feel my human identity slipping away. I learned to shift my replaced by something vast and unknowable. Though it feels like wearing the Watchers, as they call themselves, come and go. Finally, performing our day of my return arrives, and speaking in that guttural language that I now understand all too well. The leader of the Watchers, they treat me with a mixture of reverence and clinical detachment. Remember, as if I'm both a messiah and a glowing eyes boring sometimes. In moments of lucidity, I think the success of our plan. I wonder if she's looking for me. Do she realize the truth about what happened that night? Feeling the weight of this responsibility, moved on with her life like a shroud. The alternative, then with the thought that she might still shift my appearance back to that one day cross paths with these creatures. The transformation is to contemplate. I can feel my power. I try to hold on to my humanity, hidden away to remember who I was before all this. But it's getting harder with each eventually emerging. The alien thoughts are becoming my on the outskirts of the inhuman desires. The sunlight are becoming even filtered through grimy windows. And then one day, almost painful after so long, it's impossible to tell. I blink, adjusting to the sensory assault of the pain that has been my constant companion. Suddenly intensifies. I'm struck by how alien and all-consuming agony, the bustle of the scream from my so throat. Familiar now, my body's chaotic and bones cracking, humans rush past, muscles tearing, unaware of the cosmic horror. I feel as if I'm being turned inside out to the fate every atom of my being unmade and reshaped. I make my way to Megan's apartment, gather around me that my chanting reaching would have been reported. Through the haze of pain to be answered. I see anticipation as I approach her door. I can hear what they've been waiting for. Her thoughts just when I think I can't take any more. For a moment I hesitate. Death perhaps it would be kinder to let everything go still. To spare her vanishes as suddenly as it came, leaving me gasping. But my new nature is cold, calculating, maintaining connections to my own life. Then slowly I open my eyes. Crucial for the success of our plan. Or so perhaps I have. Stealing colors I've never seen before dance. The door flies open my vision, and Megan stands there, thoughts her of the eyes wide around with disbelief, as clearly as if they were speaking reaching out a trembling hand. And when I look down at my hands, is it really you? Skin that shimmers. I force my lips into a smile, iridescence, ignoring the revulsion I feel at sharp claws. It's me, Meg, firstborn. My voice a perfect imitation of my extending a hand to help. I'm home. How she collapses into my arms, my mouth sobbing with relief, and the voice that emerges is not my own. I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the resonant with power that makes the very air tremble. I feel grey skin, glowing eyes, inhuman and part of me recoils at the truth. Then the illusion snaps back into place, but that part is and I'm looking at the face of the man I once was. As I hold my sister,
The hybrid, comforting lies about where I've been, rises. A part of me marvels at the perfection of our plan. I can feel the power thrumming through my veins. I will work and the knowledge of ages at my fingertips. And all the while, the vastness of the preparing for the day when the veils between worlds fall, revealing secrets and the true masters of this planet reclaim their dominion. But I am no longer human. The coming months and years bow before me. Delicate, their new leader, their Messiah. I can sense their thoughts, while a mixture of awe, fear, and influencing events. They have waited eons for this moment. It will require patience, cunning, bridges their world, unwavering commitment to our cause. As I take in my surroundings, but as I stand there cradling my weeping sister, I realize we are in a vast underground chamber. I know the walls are covered in intricate carvings. After all, I am the history of the Watcher's interactions with humanity. And this planet, I can read the teeming billions, understanding the complex symbology that tells a tale of manipulation forever and cultivation spanning 5 years have passed since that fateful night when a simple Uber ride changed the course of human history. To the leader of the Watchers steps forward. I am a success story. Now, firstborn, we begin the next phase. A man who survived a brutal attack to the surface life around. To live among the humans. I no longer drive for Uber as one of them. Instead, but you will carry our near-death experience. You will prepare the way for our career as a motivational speaker and self-help guru. A small part of me, the last remnant of my humanity and personal transformation, resonates with but that voice is drowned out by the chorus of alien I preach now is merely a shadow of the cosmic metamorphosis, accepting my role in this cosmic with each passing day, the next few days grows, or perhaps politicians still holds little meaning. Business leaders hang on my every preparation. The masses devour my books to control my new abilities. And all the while, my true nature surface from human perception continues. I learn to shift my form, remain hidden, to appear as I once did. Grow. I've identified others with the genetic marker that makes them compatible. Finally, for transformation. The day of my one by one, they are brought into the fold. As I prepare to leave the underground chamber, we move through society like a virus, infecting key positions of power, preparing the world for the day of emergence. His glowing eyes boring into mine. In quiet moments, I remember the man I used to be. The success of our struggling Ubers on your shoulders, scraping by from ride to ride. I nod, feeling the weight of this. In a twisted way, I suppose I've achieved like a shroud. I now hold the fate of an entire species. I shift my appearance back to that of the human I once was. But the transformation is unsettling. The alien my power being that now dominates my hidden away beneath the little time for human sentimentality. I ascend through winding tunnels, eventually emerging in a derelict building as I stand before a packed auditorium. The thousands of eager faces turn through grimy windows. I feel a surge of cold amusement. They hang on my every word, adjusting to the sensory assault of the human world in their small, as I step out onto the street. I'm struck by how alien everything their world is built on the bustle of the city, that their history is a carefully constructed facade and primitive. Humans rush past, unaware of the cosmic horror walking among them, designed to inspire the fate that awaits their species. But beneath the veneer of I make my way to Megan's apartment, a deeper message knowing that my disappearance, with each carefully chosen phrase, each subtle gesture I am programming them, preparing their minds for the paradigm shift. I can hear her inside. We stand on the brink of a new era, I tell them. For a moment I hesitate, scanning the crowd. Perhaps it would be kinder to let her think me others like me, to spare her the horror of what I've become. We exchange imperceptible nods, but my new nature is cold, acknowledgement of our shared purpose. Maintaining connections to my old life is about to change. Crucial for the success of our plan. Are you ready to be part of that change? So I knock. The crowd roars its approval. The door flies open, and Megan stands there, her eyes wide wash over me. I allow myself a small smile, reaching out a trembling hand to touch my face. But not in any way these poor, doomed humans. I force my lips into a smile, ignoring the revulsion I feel at her touch. They have waited millennia for this moment. Meg, but soon, very soon, the perfect imitation of my old self. The veil between worlds will fall. She collapses into my arms, sobbing with relief. And I, over her shoulder, I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the front of this cosmic revolution. For a split second, I see my true architect of humanity's future, skin, glowing eyes between human features. Then the illusion snaps back into place, and I'm looking at the face of the man I used to be, earning a standing ovation as I hold my sister, a final thought, murmuring comforting lies about where I've been. I wonder what became. A part of me marvels at the perfection of our plan. I will live among them,
Did he ever suspect the truth?
I will work and laugh.
Does he
and
lie
love as they
awake at
do.
night,
And all the
haunted by
while,
the inconsistencies
I will be preparing for the day
by
when
the nagging
veils between
feeling that he
worlds
missed
fall,
something crucial?
and the true
Perhaps
masters
one
of this
day when the
planet
time is right, I'll pay
reclaim
him a
their
visit.
dominion.
One last ride for old
coming
time's
months
sake.
and years,
After all, I have
will be a
eternity to
delicate
play with
balancing
now.
act.
And the night
I
is
must
still
maintain
young.
my human connections while slowly, subtly influencing events to pave the way for the Watcher's arrival. It will require patience, cunning, and an unwavering commitment to our cause. But as I stand there